I had planned this camping trip for months, marking the days on my calendar and counting down like a kid waiting for Christmas. The lure of the mountains, the promise of quiet and solitude, had been irresistible. I wanted to escape the city, its noise, the people, the endless traffic, and the constant buzz of obligations that never seemed to end. I packed carefully. A large backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, cooking gear, food for 5 days, a first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, a map, compass, and even a small folding knife for emergencies. I didn't leave anything to chance. I arrived at the trailhead mid-morning, the sky a bright, cloudless blue, the air crisp and cold for late spring. The parking lot was nearly empty, a few cars scattered here and there, most of them belonging to families or hikers starting their day. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly as I adjusted my pack and stepped onto the trail. The path was well worn at first, a mixture of dirt and loose gravel winding up the mountainside. The forest was thick, with pine and fir trees stretching high, their needles whispering in the gentle breeze. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns on the ground. Birds called to one another from the treetops, and I noticed the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. At this point, everything felt serene, almost idyllic. I moved steadily, enjoying the physical exertion, the smell of damp earth and pine, the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the trail. As I climbed higher, the trail became steeper, rockier, and less clearly marked. The first half-mile was straightforward, but soon I found myself navigating narrow ledges and loose rocks. My legs burned from the effort, my hands gripping roots and boulders for balance. I made frequent stops to drink water and catch my breath. Each time I paused, I tried to absorb the surroundings. The distant peaks dusted with snow, the green valleys below, the sheer silence broken only by the wind and occasional bird call. I felt small and insignificant, a tiny figure in a vast landscape, and part of me loved it. Around late afternoon, after about 5 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing. It was perfect, a flat area of soft moss and dirt surrounded by thick trees, with a gentle slope leading down to a narrow creek. I decided this would be my campsite. I set down my pack and began unpacking. The tent went up quickly. I had practiced many times. It was a basic dome tent, small but sturdy. Once it was secure, I laid out my sleeping bag and set up my cooking area near a cluster of rocks that could serve as a makeshift stove. I spent the next hour exploring the immediate surroundings. I found small wildflowers, patches of moss, and signs of wildlife. Fresh deer tracks near the creek, a squirrel's nest in a pine tree, bird feathers caught on branches. The forest was alive, and I felt both awe and a subtle sense of caution. Being alone in such a remote area meant I had to be alert. By the time the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I started a small fire. I was careful to choose a site away from dry brush, surrounded by rocks. The crackle of the flames and the smell of burning would felt comforting, a human presence in the vast wilderness. I cooked a simple meal of rice and beans, eating slowly as the sky turned shades of orange, pink, and purple. The temperature dropped quickly, and the air smelled of cold pine and damp soil. Night fell faster than I expected. The sky turned dark, and stars appeared, countless and bright, unfiltered by city lights. I felt both awe and vulnerability at the sheer vastness of the night sky. I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and lay on my sleeping bag, listening to the forest. At first, it was peaceful. The rustle of leaves, the soft gurgle of the creek, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, something shifted. I heard a noise outside the tent, soft at first, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My heart rate jumped. I held my breath, listening. Another sound, closer this time, a distinct crunch. I didn't want to believe it, but the logical part of me knew it wasn't a figment of imagination. It was a human sound, or maybe a large animal. My flashlight was within reach, and I debated whether to get up. The sound continued intermittently, circling the tent, moving carefully. I stayed as still as I could, trying to make sense of it. The forest had always been alive with sounds, but this was different. Deliberate, cautious, almost methodical. I considered that it could be a deer, but the weight of the steps felt heavier, the pace slower than any animal I knew. My mind raced through possibilities, weighing risks. I remembered advice I had read about wilderness safety. If approached by a human you don't know, stay calm, make noise if necessary, and have a plan to defend yourself. Eventually, the steps stopped. Silence returned, almost oppressively. I didn't sleep well that night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, made me sit up in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness outside. I had packed extra batteries, and the light beam cut through the night, illuminating trees and rocks in stark white. I saw nothing, but the awareness that someone or something had been nearby left a lingering tension. Morning brought relief. Sunlight filtered through the trees, warming the campsite. I emerged from the tent cautiously, scanning the perimeter. The forest was calm, the creek flowing steadily. I decided to investigate, following the faint tracks near my tent. They were large, boot-shaped prints, heading further into the woods. My heart sank. Someone had been near my tent during the night. I checked my gear. Everything seemed intact, nothing missing. The thought that I had been observed, possibly even targeted, unsettled me. I debated whether to stay or leave. Part of me wanted to continue the trip, to conquer fear and enjoy the mountains. Another part recognized the risk. After carefully weighing options, I decided to move to a different, more secure location farther along the trail. I packed up quickly but methodically, double-checking every strap, making sure my knife and first aid kit were easily accessible. I left no obvious signs of my presence. Trash packed away, fire extinguished completely, tent dismantled. As I hiked to the new campsite, I remained vigilant. Every sound set my nerves on edge. Birds flitted through the trees, squirrels darted across the trail, but I kept focused on the path. The new site was even better. A small plateau overlooking a valley, protected by natural rock formations, with a small, hidden path to the creek. I set up camp quickly, using the rocks to secure the tent and create a barrier on one side. I spent the day fortifying my area, clearing dead branches from the perimeter, arranging rocks to create natural trip obstacles, ensuring my firewood and cooking area were safely distanced. I also took mental notes of all exit routes, ways to quickly move if necessary, and areas where someone could approach unnoticed. I felt a mix of fear and empowerment. The forest was beautiful, serene, but I had to respect its dangers, not just from wildlife but from other humans. That night, sleep was elusive but less tense. The steps didn't come back, and I convinced myself it was a one-time event. I stayed alert, flashlight nearby, knife under my pillow. I listened carefully to the night, trying to distinguish between normal forest sounds and anything unusual. Hours passed slowly, the moonlight casting silvery patterns through the trees. I eventually fell into a shallow sleep, waking intermittently, heart racing each time a sound punctuated the stillness. Over the next 2 days, I explored cautiously, collected more firewood, and observed wildlife. I noticed deer grazing in the distance, birds building nests, and even a fox moving silently through the underbrush. The forest felt alive but predictable, with its own rhythm. I kept my routine. Check the perimeter each morning, secure food, maintain the fire, and avoid leaving tracks that could reveal my location. The paranoia lingered, but I gradually learned to manage it, balancing caution with the enjoyment of solitude and natural beauty. On the fourth night, the weather shifted. Dark clouds rolled in, bringing wind and rain. I reinforced the tent, tied down extra guy lines, and made sure everything was waterproofed. Rain tapped against the fabric, the sound both soothing and oppressive. Water pooled in some areas around the campsite, and the creek swelled slightly. I stayed inside, reading, organizing my gear, and listening to the storm. The isolation felt more intense, but also protective. The rain would mask my movements and deter anyone from wandering near. Morning came with clear skies and fresh, clean air. Everything smelled of damp earth and pine, invigorating and sharp. I decided to pack up the next day and begin my return journey. The hike back would be long, but the sense of relief and accomplishment outweighed fatigue. I double-checked my map, planned a route that avoided steep, unstable areas, and made sure I had enough food and water. The hike back was grueling, but steady. I moved deliberately, taking care with every step on loose rocks and uneven ground. The tracks I had seen near my first campsite were gone, and I felt a cautious sense of safety. I thought about the person who had been nearby and how careful they must have been not to leave traces, but I also felt empowered by my preparation and awareness. I navigated difficult areas, crossed small streams, and managed fatigue with regular rests. By late afternoon on the 5th day, I reached the trailhead. The sight of cars, the distant hum of civilization, and the smell of asphalt brought an unexpected wave of relief. I loaded my backpack into the car, checked the tires and fuel, and took a deep breath. The mountains were behind me now, quiet, unyielding, and unforgettable. I left with more than just memories of beauty and solitude. I carried lessons about preparation, awareness, and the thin line between safety and danger in the wilderness. I realized that fear is not always a sign to stop, but a signal to be alert and deliberate. That trip tested my endurance, judgment, and courage, and I emerged stronger, more confident, and more respectful of the wild. The memory of those footsteps near my first campsite never fully left me, but it became a reminder rather than a source of terror. I knew I had done everything I could to stay safe, and I had succeeded. The experience reinforced my trust in preparation, observation, and careful decision-making. I still hike and camp, but now with a deeper respect for the mountains, the forest, and the hidden presence of others in those spaces. By the time I reached home, I was exhausted, sore, and covered in dust and sweat. I cleaned my gear thoroughly, reflected on every detail of the trip, and documented everything in a journal. The route, the campsites, wildlife sightings, weather changes, and the incident that had made the nights tense. Writing it down helped me process the experience, cementing the lessons learned and the relief of a trip completed safely. Looking back, it was the most intense, frightening, and rewarding camping experience I had ever had. The fear, the solitude, the preparation, the uncertainty. All of it contributed to a sense of accomplishment that was hard to describe. I knew that the forest was both beautiful and dangerous, and that respect, vigilance, and preparation were the keys to enjoying it safely. That trip stayed with me, not as a story of horror, but as a testament to survival, awareness, and the quiet, relentless beauty of the natural world. I had been planning this trip for months. After a year of nonstop work and city noise, I wanted a week of complete isolation, somewhere I could breathe, think, and just be alone with the wilderness. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the mountains. It was nothing fancy, just a wooden structure tucked away in a dense patch of forest, with a small creek running nearby and a dirt road that led miles down to the nearest town. The pictures online showed a rustic place with a stone fireplace, a few basic furniture pieces, and a porch that looked out over the trees. It seemed perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low and orange behind the ridges. The air smelled sharp and clean, like pine needles and damp earth. The road had been rough, full of potholes and loose stones, and the closer I got, the narrower it became, until I was practically driving through a tunnel of branches. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked smaller than I expected, but in a good way. It felt secluded. The gravel crunching under my tires was the only sound I could hear, aside from the distant rush of the creek. I stepped out, carrying my backpack and cooler, and took a moment to just breathe. The air was cold, sharper than I remembered in the city, and my lungs felt alive in a way they hadn't in months. The cabin smelled faintly of dust and old wood, with a hint of smoke from a previous visitor's fireplace. The windows were thin, and I could see a layer of grime on them, but nothing that made the place feel unsafe. I unlocked the door, which creaked in protest, and stepped inside. It was simple inside. There was a small living area with a couch and 2 chairs, a table with a few chairs around it, and a small wood-burning stove. To the left was a narrow hallway that led to a bedroom and bathroom. Everything was functional, though worn. The furniture had scratches and dents, the wooden floors had small gaps between the boards, and the walls had water stains in some places. It wasn't luxurious, but that wasn't why I came here. I wanted the feeling of being away from people, away from schedules and deadlines, away from the constant buzz of city life. I wanted the silence. I unpacked my things, laid out the food and water, and got a fire going in the stove. The wood had been left in a small pile near the fireplace. I stacked the logs, struck a match, and after a few tries, flames licked the kindling. The warmth from the fire began to fill the room, and I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in months. Outside, the sun had fully set, and the forest was already swallowing the light. The cabin's windows framed darkness now, the shapes of trees blotting out any view of the sky. I could hear the creek more clearly, the water bouncing over rocks in a steady, constant rush. That first night, I didn't sleep well. Not because I was scared, but because I was unused to the silence. In the city, there is always a hum of life. Cars, distant sirens, people talking. Here, the only sound was the creak and the occasional rustle of something moving outside. At one point, I heard what I thought was a branch snapping very close to the cabin. My heart jumped, and I went to the window to look, but all I could see was the pitch-black forest. I reminded myself that the area was known for wildlife, and maybe a deer or a raccoon had wandered too close. I tried to calm myself and eventually fell asleep with the fire dying down. The next morning, I woke to a gray, overcast sky. The clouds hung low, and the air smelled like wet stone and earth. I made coffee on the small stove and ate some bread and peanut butter. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a small path that led down toward the creek. The water was icy cold and clear, running fast over smooth rocks. I followed the creek upstream for a while, noticing how dense the forest became the further I went. Every so often, I would hear the crack of a branch or the scurry of some small animal in the underbrush. The solitude was exactly what I had hoped for, but it also carried an unease. When you are alone in the wilderness, every small noise seems amplified. Every shadow becomes suspicious. It's a feeling I had never experienced in the city, and it was unnerving in a way I couldn't quite name. By midday, I returned to the cabin, tired but exhilarated. I spent the afternoon chopping firewood and preparing more supplies. I checked the stove and made sure I had enough kindling. The wind started picking up as the day went on, rustling through the trees and making the cabin creak slightly. It wasn't alarming, but the sounds of the forest growing louder made me aware of just how alone I was. I kept thinking about the trail I had taken along the creek, about how far I had wandered from the cabin. The thought made me anxious. If something happened, I would have to walk a long distance to find help. It was a reminder that being alone in the wilderness carried real risks. That evening, a storm rolled in. The wind increased, shaking the trees and rattling the cabin. Rain pounded against the roof, and the creek rose with the runoff. I stayed near the fire, keeping it going, listening to the storm lash against the walls. At one point, a branch hit the cabin hard enough to leave a dent. I went outside with a flashlight to check, but the rain was heavy, and I couldn't see far. The storm reminded me how exposed this place really was. There were no neighbors for miles, no one to call for help. Just the forest and me. The thought was both terrifying and invigorating. I realized how fragile my sense of safety was when removed from the trappings of civilization. I stayed awake, trying to make out shapes through the darkness. The firelight flickered on the walls, creating shadows that seemed alive. Outside, the footsteps continued intermittently, moving closer, then retreating, always just out of clear view. I considered calling for help, but my cell service was unreliable at best. I could get a weak signal near the creek, but that meant stepping outside into the darkness with whoever or whatever was out there. I decided to wait it out, hoping that it was an animal or some harmless wanderer. I kept a heavy stick nearby, ready to defend myself if necessary. Hours passed. The sounds of the forest, normally comforting, became oppressive. Every snapping twig made me flinch. I noticed that the scratching sounds against the cabin, which I had dismissed before, were growing louder, more persistent, as if whatever was out there was testing the walls, searching for a way in. I couldn't see through the darkness, but I could hear the movement, heavy and methodical. Sleep was impossible. My muscles ached from tension, my mind a whirlwind of fear and anticipation. I tried to remind myself that I had prepared for emergencies, that I had packed tools, a knife, matches, and extra food. Yet the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. By morning, exhaustion forced me to sleep despite the unease gnawing at my mind. I woke to find no immediate signs of intrusion. The cabin looked untouched, the fire gone cold. The forest outside was quiet, deceptively peaceful. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined everything, that the isolation had played tricks on me. Yet I found marks on the side of the cabin, scratches in the wood, rough and jagged, as if made by heavy claws or perhaps a tool. The realization hit me that something or someone had been close enough to touch the cabin while I slept. My stomach turned. I began to consider leaving immediately, packing up and returning to civilization, but I also knew I had a long drive ahead. I needed a plan. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin. I piled heavy logs against the doors, placed makeshift barricades across the windows, and sharpened a few sticks as defensive tools. I set traps along the clearing, simple snares and noise traps designed to alert me if anyone approached. The forest felt different now. Where it had seemed calm and peaceful, it now felt menacing. Every shadow seemed to hide movement. Every wind gust seemed like a warning. I avoided leaving the cabin unless necessary, fetching water from the creek only during daylight. I moved quickly, staying alert at all times, my senses tuned to the smallest sounds. Night fell again, and I steeled myself for what was to come. I lit the fire early, keeping the glow bright enough to illuminate the windows. I sat close, listening intently. Hours passed. Initially, there were only the normal forest sounds, the wind, occasional animal movement. But soon, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my stick and approached the window cautiously. I could make out a dark shape moving just beyond the clearing. I held my breath, waiting. The shape stopped and seemed to observe the cabin. My heart pounded. I realized that this was no animal. The movements were deliberate, human-like. Fear surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. Panic would make me vulnerable. I stayed low, listening, preparing for any sudden action. Hours passed with intermittent noises outside. I could hear them circling, scratching, testing the cabin. The first light of dawn finally arrived, dim and gray. I had survived the night without confrontation, but the message was clear. I was being watched. I needed to leave immediately. I packed quickly, stuffing supplies into my backpack, grabbing the essentials: water, food, a first aid kit, my knife and matches. I avoided looking out the windows too long, fearing that my presence might be noted. Once I had everything, I carefully stepped outside. The forest was quiet, eerily so. I moved quickly down the path toward my car, avoiding open clearings and shadows. I didn't stop once I reached the vehicle. I loaded my backpack and gear into the trunk, locked the doors, and started the engine. The forest remained silent as I drove down the winding mountain roads. I kept my eyes on the edges of the trees, half expecting to see a figure following me. Hours later, I reached a small town, where I finally felt safe enough to stop and rest. I stayed there overnight in a motel, alert and jittery, unable to shake the memory of those nights. In the following days, I learned more about the area. Locals told me that the forest was largely deserted, but occasionally, there were reports of poachers or people living off-grid. It was plausible that someone had been observing the cabin, testing its security, perhaps looking for easy targets. The realization was chilling, but it also made me feel grateful that I had managed to survive without confrontation. I learned to appreciate the importance of preparation, vigilance, and the instinct to trust one's own perception. In the weeks that followed, I avoided remote cabins and solo trips into dense forests. I returned to city life, to the noise and stress that I had wanted to escape, but I carried a renewed respect for the wilderness. The fear I had felt was real, and the danger I had encountered had been tangible. I had faced a situation that demanded awareness, caution, and quick thinking. I survived because I acted decisively, trusted my instincts, and never let my guard down. Looking back, I realized that solitude in the wilderness is not without risk. The isolation can magnify fear, but it can also teach resilience. I had learned the hard way that preparation matters, that awareness is crucial, and that sometimes the threat is not imaginary. The forest is beautiful, but it is indifferent. It holds no malice, yet it can conceal dangers that are very real. My time at that cabin was terrifying, but it ended with clarity. I escaped unharmed, wiser, and more aware of the fragile boundary between safety and vulnerability in the wilderness. That knowledge has stayed with me, shaping how I approach the outdoors and reminding me that respect for the environment and for the unseen presence of others is not just prudent, it is essential. I never returned to that cabin, but I did return to the mountains eventually, better prepared, wiser, and far more cautious. The memory of those nights, the darkness, the footsteps outside, and the scratched walls remain vivid. But the ending was clear. I survived. I left the forest, I reached safety, and I learned lessons that will guide me for the rest of my life. I had been planning this solo trip for months. The idea of being alone in the forest, away from the noise of the city, had appealed to me ever since I had started working long hours at a stressful office job. I had never been a particularly experienced outdoorsman, but I had done my research, bought some of the right equipment, and convinced myself that a few days alone in the woods would be a kind of personal reset. The cabin I had rented was remote, deep in the mountains, and the owner had assured me it was perfectly safe. There was electricity, but no running water, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I was seeking solitude, and that meant isolation. At the time, I considered this an adventure, but what awaited me over the next few days was far beyond what I had imagined. The drive up the winding mountain roads was uneventful, though I remember noticing how quickly the scenery changed as I gained elevation. The air became crisper, the trees thicker, and the shadows longer. By the time I arrived, late in the afternoon, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks, casting everything in a muted orange glow. The cabin was exactly as advertised. A small wooden structure with a steep roof, a front porch, and a fireplace that promised warmth during the cold nights. The surrounding forest was dense, with tall pines and firs blocking the view in most directions. There was a narrow dirt path leading down to a small creek, but otherwise, I was surrounded by nothing but wilderness. After unloading my gear, I spent a few minutes exploring the cabin and the immediate surroundings. Inside, it was modest but functional. A small kitchen area with a propane stove, a table, a few shelves with basic utensils, a bathroom with a cold shower, and a single bedroom with a twin bed. The fireplace was empty, the wood stacked neatly nearby. I felt a sense of satisfaction. Everything was in order and the isolation was complete. I made a mental note to keep a fire ready for the night, knowing the temperature would drop quickly after dark. I started my first night with a sense of calm. The sun had set entirely, and darkness crept into every corner of the forest. I built a fire in the fireplace, feeling the warmth seep into my body as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering flames. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, occasionally shaking loose dead branches that hit the roof or the ground with sharp, sudden noises. I reminded myself that these sounds were normal, just the forest settling into night. I had read countless articles about how human imagination exaggerates ordinary sounds when we are alone in the dark. Still, a small knot of unease formed in my stomach. It was subtle, but it was there. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every crack of a branch outside made me tense, my eyes darting toward the window. I tried to convince myself it was only animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe a stray fox, but the forest sounded unusually active. There was a repetitive scratching sound against the side of the cabin at some point, and I could have sworn I heard a faint thump, like something heavy being dropped in the underbrush. My mind tried to rationalize it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept the fire burning until the small hours, until the flames were nothing but glowing embers, and then finally exhaustion took over. The next morning, I woke to a cold, foggy dawn. Mist clung to the trees, making the forest feel even more alien. I stepped outside, breathing in the sharp, clean air, and tried to calm myself. The sun broke through in patches, and the cabin looked peaceful again. I decided to explore the area before it got too late. I followed the dirt path toward the creek, walking slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest, birdsong, the babbling of water, the occasional rustle of leaves. Everything seemed normal, almost idyllic. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was fully up, and I felt slightly more relaxed, convinced that my imagination had made the previous night seem worse than it actually was. I spent the day setting up a more permanent living arrangement inside the cabin, stacking firewood closer to the fireplace, organizing my supplies, and checking my equipment. I also made a mental map of the surrounding area in my mind, noting the locations of the creek, the clearing near the cabin, and the trails I could follow. I reminded myself to stick to areas I knew, to avoid getting lost. The forest was vast, and I had no desire to wander too far. As night fell again, I felt a creeping sense of unease returning. The wind was stronger now, rattling the cabin in ways that made me flinch. I heard more sounds outside, branches snapping, something moving quickly through the underbrush. I tried to ignore it, but my imagination refused to cooperate. I stayed by the fire, glancing through the windows, alert for any sign of danger. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Soft at first, then unmistakable. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching over the fallen leaves and twigs just beyond the clearing around the cabin. My heart raced. I told myself that no one should be here. The nearest road was miles away, and there was no one else with access to this remote location. The thought that someone could be out there, watching me, made every nerve in my body scream in warning. The following days passed in a rhythm of solitude and survival. I explored the area further, keeping track of the trails and the creek, making mental notes of landmarks. I cooked simple meals on the stove, chopped firewood, and maintained the cabin. There were times when I felt completely at peace, listening to the water, the wind, and the occasional bird or animal. But there were also times when the isolation gnawed at me. One night, I woke to a loud, continuous banging on the cabin door. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the mud, no signs of people or animals. The storm had passed hours before. I couldn't explain it. I checked every window and door, reassured myself that I was alone, and eventually went back to bed. My nerves were on edge, but I couldn't let fear ruin the experience I had come for. About halfway through my trip, I realized I had made a critical oversight. I had brought enough food for a week, but I had miscalculated the days I would stay. Supplies were running low, and the nearest town was a long drive. I decided to make a careful trip in the middle of the day, during the brief period when the storm had passed and the clouds broke slightly. I packed a small backpack with essentials, including my knife, water, and a flashlight, and set out along the dirt road. The drive was tense. The roads were narrow, muddy from the rain, and full of fallen branches. Each bend in the road obscured my view, and I constantly worried about sliding off the side of the ridge. It took nearly an hour to reach the town, and I felt an odd relief when I saw other people again. There was a small general store where I stocked up on food, fuel for the stove, and extra supplies, and I left as quickly as possible, anxious to return to the cabin before darkness fell. The nights grew colder as the week went on. I layered clothing, kept a fire burning continuously, and made sure to check every lock and window. One night, I noticed something unusual. Footprints in the mud outside the cabin. They were large, human-like, but not recent. They didn't seem fresh enough to indicate someone was there now, but the fact they were so close to the cabin made my stomach churn. I checked the cabin thoroughly, every door, every window, even the small crawl spaces under the porch. Everything was as I had left it. I convinced myself it was probably a previous renter or maybe a hiker who had passed by during the day. Still, the sense of being watched lingered, subtle but persistent. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my tasks. Cutting wood, preparing meals, walking along the trails. I reminded myself that the wilderness is full of people I don't see, and it doesn't mean anyone is dangerous. But there were nights when I heard noises outside. The snap of a branch, a shuffle in the leaves, the crunch of footsteps. My pulse would quicken, and I would sit by the fire, shining a flashlight toward the windows, waiting, listening. No one ever appeared, yet I could feel the presence of something beyond the glass, something that reminded me how alone I truly was. On the last night of my stay, everything came to a head. I had gone out to gather water from the creek because the rain had filled the barrel I usually used with sediment, making it cloudy. The air was cold and damp, the moon hidden behind clouds, and the forest seemed impossibly still. As I filled my water containers, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching through the underbrush. My stomach tightened. I froze, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped and started again, moving closer. I could see the shadow of a person moving between the trees, their shape just faintly visible in the dim light. My first thought was panic. I had no way to call for help immediately. My phone had little signal, and I had no weapon beyond a knife. I considered running back to the cabin, but the person would see me. I decided to crouch low behind a large boulder and watch. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, stopping several times as if searching for something. I could hear them breathing, heavy and uneven. They never called out, never made any sound beyond the movement of their steps. I realized then that this wasn't random. Someone had come into this forest, to this cabin, maybe knowing someone would be here. The thought sent adrenaline surging through me. I stayed hidden, watching as the figure lingered near the creek, examining the banks, then finally moving back toward the cabin. I waited until the sounds of movement disappeared. Then I crept back to the cabin, heart hammering. I barricaded the door with a heavy chair and stacked some firewood against the windows. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the wind, the creek, and the faint sounds of movement outside. I didn't sleep, not really. I realized how vulnerable I had been. Isolation is not just a mental challenge. It's a real, physical danger. Morning came, gray and cold. I stepped outside cautiously. There were footprints around the cabin, fresh, large, and human. They showed someone had been circling the building during the night, pacing, maybe trying to intimidate. I took photographs, marked the tracks, then packed my remaining things quickly. I left the cabin, my heart still racing, my senses hyper-alert to every sound. The drive back to civilization was tense. I kept the doors locked, the windows closed, and my eyes on the roadside, half expecting to see someone lurking. But the drive passed without incident. When I finally reached the town, I reported the situation to the local authorities. They took my statements seriously, explaining that while the area was remote, there had been incidents of people using isolated cabins for illegal purposes, sometimes trespassing, sometimes worse. They offered to investigate and advised me to never go back alone. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, not as a tale of supernatural horror, but as a stark lesson in the dangers of isolation. I realized that being alone in the wilderness strips away many of the illusions of safety we carry in our daily lives. Every sound, every shadow, every unaccounted for footprint can trigger real fear. The forest is beautiful, but it is indifferent, and humans can be unpredictable, even dangerous, when no one is around. Looking back, I understand why I felt both exhilarated and terrified. The week had been transformative in ways I couldn't have predicted. I learned to respect solitude and nature, yes, but I also learned to respect human unpredictability. I now understand that fear in isolation is a practical tool. It keeps you alert, keeps you alive. And I learned that the comfort of civilization, of knowing someone is nearby, of having immediate help at your disposal, is not a luxury but a necessity when venturing into the unknown. When I tell the story, I focus not on ghosts or monsters, but on reality, the forest, the storm, the isolation, and the presence of another human being in a place meant for solitude. It is a story of vigilance, of respect for the wilderness, and of understanding the true risks that come with being completely alone. The ending, for me, was clear. Survival depends on awareness, preparation, and a deep respect for both nature and the unpredictability of other people. I left the cabin alive, cautious, and changed, carrying with me the knowledge that the wilderness is not just beautiful. It is real, and it is unforgiving. The following days passed in a rhythm of solitude and survival. I explored the area further, keeping track of the trails and the creek, making mental notes of landmarks. I cooked simple meals on the stove, chopped firewood, and maintained the cabin. There were times when I felt completely at peace, listening to the water, the wind, and the occasional bird or animal. But there were also times when the isolation gnawed at me. One night, I woke to a loud, continuous banging on the cabin door. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the mud, no signs of people or animals. The storm had passed hours before. I couldn't explain it. I checked every window and door, reassured myself that I was alone, and eventually went back to bed. My nerves were on edge, but I couldn't let fear ruin the experience I had come for. About halfway through my trip, I realized I had made a critical oversight. I had brought enough food for a week, but I had miscalculated the days I would stay. Supplies were running low, and the nearest town was a long drive. I decided to make a careful trip in the middle of the day, during the brief period when the storm had passed and the clouds broke slightly. I packed a small backpack with essentials, including my knife, water, and a flashlight, and set out along the dirt road. The drive was tense. The roads were narrow, muddy from the rain, and full of fallen branches. Each bend in the road obscured my view, and I constantly worried about sliding off the side of the ridge. It took nearly an hour to reach the town, and I felt an odd relief when I saw other people again. There was a small general store where I stocked up on food, fuel for the stove, and extra supplies, and I left as quickly as possible, anxious to return to the cabin before darkness fell. The nights grew colder as the week went on. I layered clothing, kept a fire burning continuously, and made sure to check every lock and window. One night, I noticed something unusual. Footprints in the mud outside the cabin. They were large, human-like, but not recent. They didn't seem fresh enough to indicate someone was there now. But the fact they were so close to the cabin made my stomach churn. I checked the cabin thoroughly, every door, every window, even the small crawl spaces under the porch. Everything was as I had left it. I convinced myself it was probably a previous renter or maybe a hiker who had passed by during the day. Still, the sense of being watched lingered, subtle but persistent. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my tasks. Cutting wood, preparing meals, walking along the trails. I reminded myself that the wilderness is full of people I don't see, and it doesn't mean anyone is dangerous. But there were nights when I heard noises outside. The snap of a branch, a shuffle in the leaves, the crunch of footsteps. My pulse would quicken, and I would sit by the fire, shining a flashlight toward the windows, waiting, listening. No one ever appeared, yet I could feel the presence of something beyond the glass, something that reminded me how alone I truly was. On the last night of my stay, everything came to a head. I had gone out to gather water from the creek because the rain had filled the barrel I usually used with sediment, making it cloudy. The air was cold and damp, the moon hidden behind clouds, and the forest seemed impossibly still. As I filled my water containers, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching through the underbrush. My stomach tightened. I froze, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped and started again, moving closer. I could see the shadow of a person moving between the trees, their shape just faintly visible in the dim light. My first thought was panic. I had no way to call for help immediately. My phone had little signal, and I had no weapon beyond a knife. I considered running back to the cabin, but the person would see me. I decided to crouch low behind a large boulder and watch. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, stopping several times as if searching for something. I could hear them breathing, heavy and uneven. They never called out, never made any sound beyond the movement of their steps. I realized then that this wasn't random. Someone had come into this forest, to this cabin, maybe knowing someone would be here. The thought sent adrenaline surging through me. I stayed hidden, watching as the figure lingered near the creek, examining the banks, then finally moving back toward the cabin. I waited until the sounds of movement disappeared. Then I crept back to the cabin, heart hammering. I barricaded the door with a heavy chair and stacked some firewood against the windows. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the wind, the creek, and the faint sounds of movement outside. I didn't sleep, not really. I realized how vulnerable I had been. Isolation is not just a mental challenge. It's a real, physical danger. Morning came, gray and cold. I stepped outside cautiously. There were footprints around the cabin, fresh, large, and human. They showed someone had been circling the building during the night, pacing, maybe trying to intimidate. I took photographs, marked the tracks, then packed my remaining things quickly. I left the cabin, my heart still racing, my senses hyper-alert to every sound. The drive back to civilization was tense. I kept the doors locked, the windows closed, and my eyes on the roadside, half expecting to see someone lurking. But the drive passed without incident. When I finally reached the town, I reported the situation to the local authorities. They took my statement seriously, explaining that while the area was remote, there had been incidents of people using isolated cabins for illegal purposes, sometimes trespassing, sometimes worse. They offered to investigate and advised me to never go back alone. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, not as a tale of supernatural horror, but as a stark lesson in the dangers of isolation. I realized that being alone in the wilderness strips away many of the illusions of safety we carry in our daily lives. Every sound, every shadow, every unaccounted for footprint can trigger real fear. The forest is beautiful, but it is indifferent, and humans can be unpredictable, even dangerous, when no one is around. Looking back, I understand why I felt both exhilarated and terrified. The week had been transformative in ways I couldn't have predicted. I learned to respect solitude and nature, yes, but I also learned to respect human unpredictability. I now understand that fear in isolation is a practical tool. It keeps you alert, keeps you alive. And I learned that the comfort of civilization, of knowing someone is nearby, of having immediate help at your disposal, is not a luxury but a necessity when venturing into the unknown. When I tell the story, I focus not on ghosts or monsters, but on reality, the forest, the storm, the isolation, and the presence of another human being in a place meant for solitude. It is a story of vigilance, of respect for the wilderness, and of understanding the true risks that come with being completely alone. The ending, for me, was clear. Survival depends on awareness, preparation, and a deep respect for both nature and the unpredictability of other people. I left the cabin alive, cautious, and changed, carrying with me the knowledge that the wilderness is not just beautiful. It is real, and it is unforgiving. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in a cabin deep in the forest appealed to me in ways I couldn't fully explain. I wanted to escape the city, the noise, the endless notifications and emails, the crowded streets and constant obligations. I wanted silence, I wanted isolation, and I wanted a place where I could just think or not think at all. When I found the cabin online, tucked away in a remote part of northern Vermont, it seemed perfect. Small, rustic, surrounded by thick woods, and with no neighbors for miles. The owner's pictures showed a wooden structure that looked old but solid, a dirt driveway leading up to it, and a small stream nearby. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. I arrived late in the afternoon, driving down narrow dirt roads that twisted and turned in ways that made me nervous even in broad daylight. By the time I saw the cabin, the sun was beginning to sink behind the trees, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. The cabin was larger than I expected, 2 stories, with a small porch and a stone chimney. The air smelled of wet pine and dirt, a sharp, earthy scent that made me breathe a little slower, taking it all in. I parked my car in front of the cabin, unlocked the door with the key the owner had left in a small lockbox, and stepped inside. The inside smelled faintly of dust and old wood, with the lingering odor of a fire that hadn't burned in months. It was sparsely furnished. An old wooden table, a couple of chairs, a couch, and a bed with a thick quilt. The kitchen had a gas stove and a small fridge. Everything seemed functional but old. I set my bags down, walked around the cabin slowly, running my fingers over the wood surfaces, listening to the creaks and groans of the building settling. The sound of the floorboards under my feet was unusually loud, echoing in the empty rooms. By the time I had unpacked and prepared a small dinner, the sun had disappeared completely. I lit the fireplace in the living room, feeding it with the dry wood stacked nearby, and sat on the couch staring at the flames. The silence outside was immense. There was no wind, no birds, no rustling in the underbrush, only the faint, distant gurgle of the stream. First, it was peaceful. I felt a rare kind of calm wash over me. Then, as night fell completely, I began to notice the other sounds. Very faint at first, almost like scratching or tapping, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I stopped moving, listening carefully. The sound was irregular, not like an animal walking in the leaves. It was heavier, deliberate, almost human. I forced myself to shake it off. It was probably a deer, a raccoon, or some other animal wandering too close to the cabin. I went to bed early, feeling slightly uneasy, but not alarmed. I slept lightly, waking several times to the small creaks and pops of the cabin settling, to the whisper of the wind through the trees, or the distant murmur of the stream. Around 2 in the morning, I woke fully. Something was wrong. I could hear movement outside again, this time closer, more deliberate. Footsteps. I froze under the covers, straining to hear. There was a pattern to the steps, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. I debated getting up, getting my phone, or even calling someone, but I had no cell signal. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I knew there was nothing supernatural, nothing I couldn't explain rationally. But my body did not care for rationality. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking, and I could feel sweat pooling at my lower back. The steps stopped for a moment, then resumed, moving closer to the side of the cabin. The scratching noise came again, and I realized it wasn't just steps. It was someone testing the walls, pushing on the siding, looking for weakness. I stayed still, silent, listening as the person or people walked slowly around the cabin, circling it like predators assessing their prey. I didn't dare move. I could hear the faint sound of breathing now, but it was outside, not near my bed. After what felt like an eternity, the noises receded slightly. I stayed awake, frozen, until dawn, my ears straining for every crack and whisper in the forest. When the first pale light of morning crept through the windows, I cautiously approached the door. The porch was empty, no footprints in the dirt, no signs that anyone had been near the cabin. I told myself it was a dream or my imagination, or a raccoon scratching at the wood. But the unease remained. I spent the day trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all, that the forest simply made sounds in ways I didn't understand. I walked to the stream, noting the broken branches and trampled undergrowth along the path, which could easily have been animals. But a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, waiting for nightfall. I checked the doors and windows repeatedly, making sure everything was locked and latched. That night, the same sounds returned. The slow, heavy steps circling the cabin, the scratching against the walls. I stayed in bed, silent, heart racing, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Around midnight, the steps grew louder. The scratching became insistent. I realized they were trying to open the back door. Someone had found it unlocked or had been testing it all night. I had locked it, but maybe it hadn't latched completely. Fear gave me clarity. I couldn't rely on hope or luck. I had to be ready. I got up carefully, grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen, and positioned myself near the back door. I could hear the person, or maybe 2 people, fumble with the lock. The door rattled slightly, then stopped. Silence. I waited, every muscle tense. Then came the sound of footsteps retreating, moving toward the front of the cabin. I stayed crouched near the door for hours, listening. The sun was already rising when I finally allowed myself to move. I went outside cautiously. There were footprints, heavy boots, leading from the front of the cabin into the woods. They were large, at least a men's size 12. The prints disappeared after 100 feet or so. I examined the back door carefully. The lock had been tampered with, scratches on the metal where someone had forced it. Panic set in fully then. I realized that I was not safe here. Someone had been inside the woods all night, watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep, waiting for me to be alone. The remote location that had seemed so appealing now felt like a trap. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, loading my bags into the car. I checked every window and door again, making sure everything was locked behind me. I drove out slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror constantly, feeling as if someone might be following me through the forest. The roads were narrow and winding, and I kept my headlights on full beam, scanning every shadow. When I reached the main road and finally saw a gas station, I pulled in, shaking. I called the owner from the station's payphone, explaining that I had to leave immediately. He sounded concerned but not surprised. He admitted that people occasionally tried to break into cabins in that area, targeting tourists who stayed alone. The isolation that drew me in had made me a target. The following days, I stayed in a small motel in a nearby town, too anxious to return home immediately. I slept poorly, jumped at every sound, and checked every lock repeatedly. But eventually, the fear faded enough for me to resume some semblance of normal life. I sold the cabin booking, refusing ever to go back to that area, and made a strict rule for myself: never stay alone in remote locations where I could be trapped or watched. The experience left a lasting mark. I learned to appreciate solitude, but also to respect the risks that come with it. Isolation can be peaceful and restorative, but it can also leave you exposed, vulnerable to people who see your vulnerability as opportunity. I understood now that fear was not always irrational. Sometimes it was survival, and sometimes it was the only thing keeping you alive. Months later, I told a few close friends about the cabin, and they were shocked. Many couldn't imagine why I would go alone to a place so remote. I didn't dwell on it with them. It wasn't something to be shared lightly. I never returned, never tried to face the fear, and I didn't need to. The lesson had been clear enough. Realistic danger is nothing like a story or a film. It's silent, subtle, and patient. It waits for the right moment. And when you are alone, it doesn't matter how strong or prepared you think you are. It only takes one opportunity. I still think about the cabin sometimes. I remember the smell of the old wood, the sound of the stream, the feel of the heavy iron pan in my hands as I waited in the dark. And I remember the steps outside my door, deliberate and unhurried. That memory, more than anything, keeps me cautious, alert, and alive. I never stayed in a cabin alone again, and I never will. I stick to crowded campgrounds or rented homes in towns where neighbors are close enough that something unusual would be noticed. I go into the forest now with a friend, never alone. Fear, I learned, is an excellent teacher, and I owe my life to the caution it instilled in me that night. The cabin remains a vivid memory of terror, of being powerless, of being watched. But it also remains a reminder that awareness, preparation, and respect for realistic danger can be the difference between survival and disaster. The forest is beautiful, the air clean, the water cold and clear, but beauty and danger often coexist. That night at the cabin taught me that lesson in the most intense and frightening way possible. And I carry it with me, not as a story to thrill others, but as a lesson to survive, to respect the unknown, and to never underestimate what the world can do when it decides to test you. I had planned the cabin trip for weeks, meticulously going over every detail to ensure nothing would go wrong. I was tired of the city, tired of the constant noise, the lights that never turned off, the people who never stopped talking about things that did not matter. I needed silence and I needed space, and the small, isolated cabin I had rented deep in the mountains promised both. It was a simple wooden structure, built decades ago, with a small porch, a stone chimney, and walls that looked weathered but solid. The surrounding forest stretched in all directions, a mix of pines, oaks and birches, and a narrow dirt road led from the highway to the cabin, winding through thick brush and steep hills. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows that made the trees look like they were reaching toward me. I parked my car on a small patch of gravel in front of the cabin and stepped out, feeling the crisp mountain air against my face. It smelled of pine and wet soil, with a faint trace of smoke from a distant fire pit that someone must have used the night before. The silence was immediate and total, broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the treetops and the occasional crack of a branch. I unlocked the cabin door, which creaked as it swung open, and stepped inside. The interior was small but cozy, with a wooden floor that had begun to warp in places, simple furniture, and a small fireplace in the corner. There was a bed, a table, and a few chairs, all worn but functional. A thin layer of dust covered the surfaces, but the place smelled clean, like the wood itself had absorbed the scent of the forest. I set down my bags and went through my routine. I unpacked some clothes, checked the supplies I had brought, and made sure the cabin had basic amenities like water and electricity. The water came from a small well nearby, and I could hear the faint hum of the electric generator in the distance. Everything seemed normal. I decided to go for a short walk around the property before nightfall to stretch my legs and get a sense of the land. The forest was dense, and the ground was uneven, covered with fallen leaves and broken branches. I noticed tracks in the soil, probably deer or smaller animals, but nothing that made me uneasy. I walked to the edge of a small clearing behind the cabin and looked up at the mountains. The sun was almost gone, leaving a dim orange glow behind the peaks. I felt a sense of peace, a rare calm that I had not felt in months. I returned to the cabin as the sky darkened. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, watching the flames dance and listening to the soft crackling of burning wood. The warmth spread slowly through the room, chasing away the chill that had settled in. I ate a simple dinner I had brought with me, canned soup and bread, and cleaned up afterward. By the time I finished, it was dark, the kind of dark that only exists far from city lights, where the sky is a black velvet and stars cover every inch. I opened the window slightly, letting in the cool night air and listening to the sounds of the forest. First, everything was normal. I could hear the wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of small animals, maybe raccoons or squirrels moving through the underbrush. But after a while, I noticed something different. There was a sound in the distance, faint at first, but growing steadily. It was a snapping sound, like branches breaking under weight, and it seemed to move closer. I froze and listened, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. The snapping continued, slow and deliberate, accompanied by the faint crunch of leaves. It was too consistent to be random. My pulse quickened. I walked to the window and peered into the darkness, straining my eyes, but I could see nothing. The forest was a solid black mass, and the moonlight only highlighted the tops of the trees. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just a deer or a bear. The forest was alive with wildlife, and I had been told to expect encounters with animals. But the sound kept coming, and it was no longer random. It was moving in a straight line toward the cabin, and I could hear it pausing, then continuing. My stomach tightened. I considered going outside, but the darkness and isolation made the thought impossible. I went to the door and locked it, checking the windows. All secure. I thought about calling someone, but my phone had little reception, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I was alone, completely alone, and that realization hit me harder than the cold wind blowing through the trees. The snapping stopped suddenly. I held my breath, listening. For several minutes, there was nothing. The forest returned to its natural sounds, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to distract myself, pouring water and preparing for bed, but sleep was elusive. Every sound seemed amplified. The crack of a branch, the whisper of wind through the leaves, even the small creaks of the cabin settling in the cold night. Hours passed. I dozed lightly, waking at intervals, each time straining to hear the forest outside. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was closer, unmistakable. Heavy footsteps, slow but deliberate, moving through the brush toward the cabin. I grabbed the small flashlight I had brought and shone it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows and swaying branches. I could see the outlines of trees and the uneven ground, but no figure. Yet the sounds were unmistakable. Whoever or whatever it was close. The pounding of my heart in my chest felt deafening. I moved quietly to the bedroom, where I had stored my emergency supplies, and grabbed a small hatchet. It was not much, but it was all I had. The steps stopped again. Silence returned, heavier than before. I could feel my muscles tense, ready for movement, but nothing happened. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the door handle rattled. My blood ran cold. Someone was trying to open the door. I raised the hatchet, holding it tightly, listening to the metal of the handle twist. Whoever it was strong. I could hear them testing the lock, pushing against the door. My mind raced. I had to survive, and the cabin offered limited options. I considered the windows, but they were old and hard to open. I backed away from the door, looking for another way out, but the small cabin left me trapped. The rattling stopped as suddenly as it began. Silence fell again. I crouched low, listening, sweat running down my face, my hands trembling. After what felt like an eternity, I heard another sound. A soft scratching, coming from the back of the cabin. Someone had moved around to the other side. I could see the faint outline of a shadow through the thin walls. My pulse was so fast I thought it might burst through my chest. I stayed crouched, gripping the hatchet, trying to think. The forest was dark, and the cabin offered some protection, but I could not stay hidden forever. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning. At some point, I fell into a restless doze, only to wake to the sound of my own breathing and the faint scratching continuing outside. I realized then that whoever was out there was patient, deliberate, and possibly familiar with the terrain. I had no way of knowing how long they had been watching. Fear settled deep into my bones. I could not call for help. I could not escape. I was completely alone, except for the presence of something, or someone, outside my walls. Morning arrived slowly. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the trees, and with it, a sense of relief. Whoever had been outside had left. The door and windows were intact, and there were no signs of forced entry. I ventured outside cautiously, scanning the area. The ground was disturbed in multiple places, footprints leading around the cabin, heavy and deliberate. I could see broken branches where someone had moved through the forest. My heart was still racing, but the fear of the night began to give way to determination. I took photographs of the tracks and made a careful survey of the surrounding area, noting escape routes and possible places to defend myself if needed. I decided I could not stay. I packed my belongings, taking only what I could carry, and left the cabin, careful not to alert anyone in the forest to my movements. The road back to the highway was long and steep, but I moved quickly, glancing over my shoulder constantly. I did not see anyone, but I could feel the presence of the forest, watchful and silent. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for several minutes, catching my breath and trying to calm myself. I started the engine and drove away slowly, keeping my eyes on the road and the edges of the forest. When I reached the highway and civilization, I allowed myself to relax slightly. I called the local sheriff and reported what had happened, providing the details and photographs. They promised to investigate, but I knew the chances of finding the person who had been outside the cabin were slim. The forest was vast and the trails were many. I drove home, exhausted, every sound of the city amplifying my relief. I had survived, but the memory of the night haunted me. I realized that fear was not just a momentary thing. It could linger for years, shaping the way you saw the world. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with local authorities to inspect the property. They confirmed my suspicions. Someone had been watching the cabin for weeks, possibly living in the forest nearby. The tracks and signs of movement indicated a level of patience and familiarity that was terrifying. The person had disappeared before we could confront them. The cabin was no longer safe, and I decided to sell the property. The sense of relief I felt then was immense. I knew I would never go back to that forest, but I also knew that I had survived because I had stayed calm, observed carefully, and trusted my instincts. That night, the fear had been real, but so had my ability to face it, and that knowledge stayed with me. A reminder that preparedness and awareness can save a life when danger comes quietly and unexpectedly. Even now, years later, I cannot walk in the forest without feeling the echo of that night. I can hear the snap of a branch, the whisper of leaves, and my heart tightens. But I also remember the clarity I had when I needed it most, the careful steps, the attention to detail, the focus that allowed me to survive. The forest is beautiful, but it is also patient, and it hides more than it shows. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I carry it with me every time I leave the safety of civilization and step into the quiet, watching world of the woods. It started as a simple plan. I had been working nonstop for months, juggling a job that demanded everything from me and a life that barely gave me rest. The thought of escaping into the woods for a week, staying in a small cabin off the grid, was the only thing keeping me sane. The cabin I found was remote, hidden deep in the forest, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound its way through dense trees and uneven ground. The images online showed a rustic, wooden structure with a small porch and a fireplace. It looked isolated enough to be peaceful, but not so far that it would be impossible to reach help if I needed it. I told myself it would be a week of rest, maybe a week of hiking, reading, and solitude. The drive there was longer than I expected. The dirt road became more like a trail as I drove further in, and the cell service faded until it was non-existent. That should have been my first warning sign, but I ignored it, telling myself that this is exactly why I wanted to come here. Finally, I saw the cabin through a gap in the trees, small but solid, with smoke curling from the chimney even though no one was supposed to be there. The surrounding forest was thick and silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and expectant. I parked, took my backpack, and started unloading supplies. Food, water, firewood, blankets, a first aid kit, and tools. I made a mental note of all the exits and windows, checking that the doors locked tightly. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels normal until you realize how little background noise you are used to. In the city, there is always a hum of electricity, engines, people, but here, it was only the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch. I built a small fire in the fireplace and ate a simple meal, feeling that rare sense of relief that comes with being alone in nature. I slept well, or at least as well as I expected, because being in a new place, even a peaceful one, keeps the body slightly alert. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I walked along a faint trail I had noticed while approaching the cabin. It wound through dense woods and up a small hill. The sun was high, filtering through the trees, casting uneven shadows on the ground. The forest seemed calm, almost serene, but every now and then, I would hear a distant noise, a branch snapping or leaves rustling in a way that didn't match the wind. I shrugged it off as animals. Deer, maybe a fox. I wasn't thinking about humans, and certainly not danger. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed that the door, which I had locked before leaving, was slightly ajar. My stomach sank. I could have sworn I had locked it. I checked inside carefully. Nothing seemed out of place, no footprints, no moved objects, nothing. Just the faint impression that someone, maybe an animal, had brushed past the doorway. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe the door hadn't latched fully, but the unease settled in my chest like a weight. That night, I slept poorly. Every sound outside, the wind, the branches, the distant rustle of leaves, made me wake. At one point, I could have sworn I heard footsteps on the porch. I stayed still, listening, and eventually the sound stopped. I kept the fire going longer than usual, making sure all entrances were secure. By morning, the feeling of unease had dulled, replaced by a cautious alertness. The next day, I decided to hike further into the forest. I wanted to push my comfort zone, see more of the area, and maybe discover why it had been abandoned. I packed food, water, and a small first aid kit, and left the cabin in broad daylight. The trail became less defined, twisting among thick trees and over roots that jutted from the ground. At one point, I came across an old campsite, a fire pit long dead, rusted cans, and a torn sleeping bag left behind. It looked like someone had been here years ago, maybe longer. I felt a strange curiosity, mixed with unease. The forest was thick, the sunlight dim, and I realized I could easily lose my way. I turned back, feeling relief when I saw the cabin in the distance. By the third night, I noticed small signs that someone else might have been watching. Branches broken in odd ways near the cabin, footprints in the dirt around the perimeter, too small to be from an adult man, too large for a dog. The wind was strong that night, rattling the windows, and I lay awake on the bed staring at the ceiling. I double-checked the locks, secured the windows with furniture, and even tied the back door with a rope through the handle. I had a knife on the nightstand and my backpack with supplies ready, but my sleep was restless, full of brief jolts awake every time I imagined a shadow moving outside. The next morning, I decided I needed to investigate. I walked slowly around the cabin, examining the footprints. They were human, small, perhaps a teenager, and they ended at the edge of the trees. Whoever it was, they had not entered the cabin. I tried to reason with myself, maybe a local kid sneaking into the forest. Still, the thought of someone observing me without my knowledge gnawed at the back of my mind. I kept my phone with me, though I knew service was non-existent. That afternoon, while gathering firewood a few meters from the cabin, I heard voices. Quiet, distant, impossible to identify, almost carried by the wind. My heart rate spiked. I froze looking around. The forest was dense, and I couldn't see anyone. The voices stopped abruptly. I considered leaving immediately, but I decided I needed to stay calm and collected. I returned to the cabin quickly, locking the door behind me and checking all windows. I spent the rest of the day inside, avoiding the forest. That night, the real fear began. Around midnight, there was a loud banging on the front door. Heavy, deliberate, repeated. My first thought was panic. Someone was here outside and they were trying to get in. I grabbed the knife and backpack, ready to escape, but I knew the forest was too dense, the roads too treacherous for a fast exit. I stayed low, breathing silently, listening. The banging stopped. Hours passed. I didn't sleep, sitting by the fireplace, watching the windows. Every sound, even the soft crackle of the fire, seemed amplified in the quiet. In the morning, I found fresh footprints around the cabin. They were larger than the small ones I had seen before, adult size and unmistakably human. Whoever had been there had circled the cabin carefully, like they were studying it. Panicked, my first thought was to leave immediately, but I knew the dirt road was miles away and the trail could be dangerous if someone was nearby. I spent the day preparing. I gathered more firewood, set up makeshift barricades, and kept a low profile inside the cabin. I kept all doors and windows locked and covered. That afternoon, I noticed something else. Small marks in the dust inside the cabin. On the wooden floor near the back window, faint smudges of dirt that had no explanation. I hadn't left the window open. Someone had been inside. The reality hit me hard. I wasn't alone in the forest. Someone had been inside my cabin while I was sleeping. My panic escalated into fear bordering on terror, but I forced myself to remain calm. Panicking would get me nowhere. I spent the next day hiding in the cabin, watching the forest edges. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was constant. At one point, I saw movement between the trees, a glimpse of a figure, too quick to identify. I assumed it was the same person, someone local, maybe a trespasser who had been living in the woods. The idea of calling the police crossed my mind, but with no signal and miles from help, it felt pointless. I had to rely on myself. That night, I made a plan. I prepared an escape route, keeping my backpack ready, knife in hand, flashlight charged, and doors barricaded as best as I could. I decided I wouldn't wait for them to try to enter again. If I had to leave, I would leave fast. I stayed alert, listening for any sound. Hours passed. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, the quietest step on the porch. Slow, deliberate, like someone testing the boards. My heart pounded. I waited. The steps stopped. I counted silently, watching the shadowy shapes through the blinds. Nothing moved. I realized then that I had been trapped in my own fear. The constant tension, the isolation, and the unknown had consumed me. I took a deep breath and decided I had to act. Before dawn, I grabbed my supplies, checked my shoes and clothing, and stepped into the forest, sticking to the trail I had explored before. I walked fast, careful to avoid noisy branches and loose leaves, keeping low and silent. The forest was dense, but I knew the general direction of the road. I moved cautiously, occasionally hiding behind trees, listening. Hours passed. I was exhausted, my legs sore, my lungs burning. The forest felt endless. At one point, I almost tripped on a root and froze, convinced the figure had seen me, but nothing appeared. Eventually, I emerged from the trees onto a gravel road I recognized from my drive-in. Relief washed over me. I ran, shouting, waving my arms, hoping someone would see me. A car approached after what felt like an eternity, and I flagged it down. The driver, surprised, agreed to take me to the nearest town. In town, I reported everything to the police. The cabin, the footprints, the intrusion. They took my statement seriously but admitted they had limited ability to patrol such a remote area. They suggested I stay somewhere safer and avoid returning to that location. The days that followed were filled with lingering fear and unease. I couldn't shake the memory of being watched, of realizing someone had been in the cabin while I slept. It took months before I could walk outside at night without checking shadows and listening for every sound. I never returned to that forest. The experience left me with a hard-earned respect for isolation and for the unpredictability of human behavior. Nature itself had been peaceful, but the presence of another human had turned that peace into terror. I realized that danger isn't always obvious. It can be patient, hidden, and observant. Eventually, I found peace again, but it came slowly. I moved closer to civilization, chose less remote getaways, and always checked locks, windows, and doors twice. I learned to trust my instincts and to act before fear becomes paralysis. The cabin still exists, hidden in the woods, probably visited by others who seek solitude, but I will never go back. The memory of the footsteps, the banging, and the presence in my cabin remains vivid, a reminder that even the quietest places can hold real danger. I also learned to prepare for isolation, to bring extra supplies, to have a plan for escape, and to respect the unknown elements of remote areas. Nature is beautiful, but alone and unprotected, it can turn frighteningly unpredictable when other humans are involved. Looking back, I realized the ordeal was not about the forest or the cabin. It was about awareness, caution, and respect for the unknown. I survived because I stayed alert, stayed calm, and acted decisively when I had to. The fear was real, the danger was real, and I came through it intact. I carry that experience with me, a constant reminder that even in solitude, vigilance is crucial. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. The city had been suffocating me with its noise, its constant rush, and the way life seemed to demand energy I didn't have. I had found a small cabin online, far away from anything remotely resembling civilization, tucked into a dense forest near a mountain range. The reviews were minimal, but the pictures showed a rustic wooden cabin, a small lake nearby, and trails that disappeared into thick stands of pine and fir. I convinced myself it was the perfect place to unwind, to escape the constant hum of human presence, and to reconnect with the slow rhythm of nature. The drive out of the city had been long, more than 4 hours, and as the roads narrowed and wound through hills and forests, my anticipation grew. The last 20 minutes had been on gravel roads that were barely marked, lined with trees that arched over the path, casting shadows that moved with the wind. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, orange and soft, filtering through the pine needles. The cabin appeared suddenly, a small wooden structure with a porch that overlooked a dark, still pond. It was beautiful in a quiet, isolated way. I parked my car, unloaded my bag, and breathed in the cold, pine-scented air, feeling like I had finally arrived somewhere safe. The cabin itself was modest. 2 bedrooms, a small living area with a wood-burning stove, a kitchen that had only the basics, and a small loft that I assumed I could use for extra sleeping space. There was no electricity except for a few solar lights, no Wi-Fi, and a faint satellite signal that barely reached my phone. For the first time in months, I felt detached from the outside world. I unpacked my things, stacked wood for the stove, and started a fire. The smell of burning pine filled the cabin, warm and comforting. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and I could hear the water lapping at the edge of the pond. It was peaceful, but there was a certain tension in the air I couldn't quite identify yet. That night, the sounds of the forest were sharper than I expected. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump slightly, though I reminded myself that it was just animals moving about. I lay in the loft bed, listening to the wind and distant calls of birds settling in for the night. I had left the windows slightly open, wanting the fresh air, but it let in more than just the scent of pine. The occasional brush of branches against the cabin made shadows flicker on the walls. I kept telling myself it was normal, that the forest had its own life, but I didn't sleep as deeply as I wanted. The next morning, I decided to explore the trails I had seen in the pictures. I packed a small bag with water, some snacks, a map, and a flashlight, even though it was morning. The trail started easily, soft dirt and pine needles underfoot, winding gently through the trees. First, everything was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, birds flitted between branches, and the air smelled of damp earth and moss. But after about half an hour, the trail split, and I realized that the markings on the trees were faint, barely noticeable. I had thought I could just wander and find my way back easily, but the forest quickly became disorienting. I tried to stay calm and follow the trail, but after another 30 minutes, I noticed something unsettling. There were footprints in the soft dirt, large, booted footprints that didn't match my hiking boots. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soil, and heading in the same direction I was going. I stopped, staring at them, my heart beginning to race. There was no one else around, no other hikers, no voices. Just me and the forest and these prints. I debated whether to turn back, but something made me keep going. A stubborn curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the disbelief that someone could be walking out here unnoticed. As I continued, I started noticing more signs. Small items, like a broken branch deliberately placed across a path, stones piled unnaturally at the base of a tree, and the occasional scrap of paper or plastic that looked deliberately left. My imagination began running wild. I told myself it could just be other hikers or the wind moving things, but deep down I felt uneasy. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt deliberate, as if someone was shaping it, leaving markers for me to see. I picked up my pace, scanning constantly, listening for any sound besides the wind and the occasional bird. Hours passed and the trail became less defined. The sun was dipping low in the sky, and the forest shadows lengthened. Panic began to settle in. I realized I didn't know exactly where I was. The trail markers had become rare, and I felt as though I had walked in circles. The footprints I had seen earlier had disappeared, but the signs of deliberate disturbance continued. Rocks and sticks placed in unnatural ways, small depressions in the dirt as though someone had been crouching or observing. I decided it was time to turn back. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything started looking the same. Trees, shadows, the way the light hit the undergrowth. It was all confusing, and I could feel my anxiety rising with every passing minute. By the time darkness truly fell, I was lost. I stopped trying to force myself down a trail and instead focused on finding a place to stay the night. I had a flashlight, some water, and a small backpack of supplies, but I knew I couldn't wander blindly in the dark. I found a small clearing, a little higher than the surrounding area, with enough space to sit and rest. I built a small fire using dry branches and pine needles, trying to reassure myself that the fire would provide warmth and safety. I stayed close to it, keeping my eyes on the forest around me, listening to every sound. The wind had picked up, causing the trees to groan and branches to scrape against each other. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the faint crunch of leaves underfoot, like someone walking slowly through the forest. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep was impossible. I alternated between dozing near the fire and sitting awake, scanning the dark tree line. Hours passed like this. At one point, the wind blew strongly, almost extinguishing the fire, and I had to feed it with more pine needles and branches. My hands were sore, my throat dry, and my muscles cramped from hours of tension. I kept thinking about the cabin, how close it had seemed in daylight, how reachable it had felt, and now it felt impossible, a distant memory. Morning came, though I hadn't really slept. The light revealed a forest that seemed unchanged, yet somehow more menacing. The footprints had returned overnight, leading toward the direction I thought the cabin might be. It was impossible to tell, but I made the decision to follow them, reasoning that they could lead me back. Every step was cautious, every sound amplified in my mind. Birds had started singing again, and squirrels moved in the underbrush, but their normalcy did nothing to ease the tight knot in my chest. I followed the tracks for what felt like hours. Occasionally, I would see signs of human presence. A piece of rope hanging from a tree, a fragment of plastic, a small pile of rocks, all pointing in the same direction. I tried to stay calm and rational, convincing myself that whoever had left these signs hadn't meant to harm me. But fear made my mind invent all kinds of possibilities. By mid-morning, my water was nearly gone, and my stomach rumbled. Hunger and thirst made every step heavier, but I continued, because the thought of staying lost in the forest indefinitely was worse. Then I saw it. In a small clearing, partially hidden by trees, was the cabin. I recognized it immediately, the porch, the small lake beside it, and the familiar shape of the roof. Relief hit me in a wave, and I broke into a jog, adrenaline fueling me. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. There were signs of recent movement. Footprints around the porch, the fire pit had been used recently, and small pieces of food scattered nearby. Someone had been at the cabin while I was gone, and for a moment panic returned. I slowed down, scanning the surroundings carefully. No one appeared, just the cabin and the forest. I approached the door cautiously. It was unlocked, which I had forgotten to do when I left, and I slipped inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine, familiar and comforting. I immediately locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and settled near the stove. I was shaken, exhausted, and dehydrated, but the relief of being back in a known, secure space was overwhelming. I filled a pot with water from the sink, boiled it, and drank, feeling my body relax slightly with each sip. I ate a small meal, and then, after hours of tension, I finally allowed myself to lie down. The cabin felt alive in a different way than the forest, alive with the memory of human presence, of safety, of shelter. The next few days were cautious. I didn't go far from the cabin, exploring only small sections of the nearby area. I made sure to mark my path carefully, to observe all signs of recent human activity, and to keep myself visible in case someone was tracking the same trails. I realized that the forest could be dangerous not because of supernatural forces or wild animals alone, but because of other humans, and because of the isolation that made every small sound, every small movement a source of anxiety. I stayed aware constantly, and slowly, cautiously, I started to enjoy the quiet, the gentle rustle of trees, the water lapping against the lake, and the slow rhythm of life in isolation. By the end of the week, I felt stronger, more aware, and strangely resilient. I understood that fear in such isolation was natural, that it sharpened senses and forced attentiveness, but that it could be managed by caution, observation, and preparation. I left the cabin with a deep respect for the forest, for its quiet power, and for the fragile sense of safety that came from knowledge and attention. I drove back to the city feeling different, more cautious, more alive, and with a newfound appreciation for the simple presence of human safety. The experience stayed with me, but not as a haunting memory. It was a lesson in awareness, in the balance between curiosity and caution, and in understanding that fear often comes from what is real, not imagined. I would return to the forest someday, better prepared, aware of its hidden dangers, but never underestimating the subtle ways isolation could amplify the ordinary into something terrifying. I had been planning this trip for months. I needed a break from the city, from the endless noise and the constant pressure of work, and I thought that a weekend alone in the woods would be the perfect escape. I found a small cabin online, off the grid, far away from the nearest town. The pictures made it look quiet, isolated, surrounded by tall pine trees with a small clearing nearby. The description promised peace, solitude, and fresh air. I packed my bags with the usual supplies: food, water, camping gear, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a map, and a compass. I also brought my phone, even though I knew there might not be a signal, just in case of emergency. The drive itself was long. The highway faded into winding roads, narrow paths that cut through dense forests. The sunlight began to dip behind the trees as I drove deeper into the woods, the air growing cooler and heavier with the scent of pine and damp soil. I noticed how quiet it was. There were no cars, no voices, only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. That quiet made me uneasy at first, but I reminded myself that was exactly what I had wanted. When I finally reached the turnoff for the cabin, I had to slow down to a crawl. The road was barely more than a dirt path, uneven and full of small rocks. My car bounced over the surface, and I had to be careful not to scrape the undercarriage. Eventually, I saw a small clearing up ahead, and there it was, the cabin. It was wooden, 2 stories, with a small porch and a chimney. Smoke wasn't rising from it, but that didn't matter. The area was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I parked my car and stepped out. The air smelled clean, crisp, and slightly damp. My bag felt heavy on my shoulder, but I felt light inside, almost free, as if I had left all my problems behind in the city. The cabin itself was rustic but sturdy. The wooden walls were solid, the roof intact, and the windows showed no cracks. Inside, it was simple. A living area with a small kitchen, a table, a couch, and a wood stove. There was a loft upstairs with a bed, blankets neatly folded. I set my bag down, unpacked a few things, and went outside to explore the immediate area. There was a small fire pit, a stack of chopped wood, and a path leading further into the woods. The forest looked deep, dark, and endless. I felt a thrill of excitement. This was exactly the kind of isolation I wanted, the kind that made you feel small in the middle of the world. I decided to start a fire in the stove. I had brought a small bundle of wood from home, just to be sure I could get it going. As the fire crackled, I cooked a simple meal: canned beans, some bread, a few slices of cheese. I ate slowly, listening to the sound of the flames and the occasional bird or squirrel outside. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. Once I had eaten, I cleaned up, filled a jug with water from the tap, and sat by the fire, watching the shadows dance along the walls. The sun had set completely now, and darkness filled the forest outside. The cabin felt warm and safe inside, the walls keeping the night at bay. I went upstairs to my bed, read for a while, and eventually drifted into sleep. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that made my heart jump. A snap, like a branch breaking, somewhere outside. I froze. My first thought was an animal. There were deer around here, maybe even a fox or a raccoon. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that the cabin was secure and the sound was normal. But then I heard it again. A soft scraping, slow and deliberate, coming from the side of the cabin. I didn't move. I strained my ears. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was the wind or an animal brushing against the wood. Still, I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed awake, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, every whisper of the wind through the trees. By the time morning came, I felt drained, tense, like I hadn't rested at all. I decided to go for a walk, to clear my head. I grabbed a flashlight, my boots, and headed down the narrow trail that ran behind the cabin. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I walked for a while, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of my steps, trying to calm the lingering unease. But as I walked, I noticed signs that something had been moving through the forest recently. Broken branches, footprints that weren't mine, marks on tree trunks. My stomach tightened. I reminded myself that animals lived here, maybe even hunters. It didn't necessarily mean anything, but there was a pattern, a direction to the disturbances, as if someone or something had been circling the cabin, moving through the woods at night. I turned back, returning to the cabin with a growing sense of caution. Once inside, I checked the locks, made sure the doors were secure. I lit another fire in the stove, paced a little, and tried to think logically. Maybe I was overreacting. I was alone, yes, and the forest was isolated, yes, but that didn't automatically mean danger. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I barely slept again. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow against the walls seemed too sharp, too deliberate. By the third night, I was almost at the edge of panic, even though the cabin itself was solid and nothing had actually entered it. I decided that I needed to be proactive. I couldn't just sit and wait for something to happen. I checked my supplies: food, water, flashlight batteries, knife, hatchet. I also had a small fire extinguisher, matches, and rope. I moved furniture slightly, making sure nothing blocked the doors or windows. I stacked the firewood in a way that I could easily access it, either to burn or to use as a makeshift barricade if necessary. I even moved a chair by the main window, sitting there at intervals during the night to watch for any movement outside. I realized I was becoming hyper-aware, almost paranoid, but I knew that awareness could be the difference between safety and danger in a truly isolated environment. On the fourth night, things escalated. I had been sitting by the window, eyes trained on the forest, when I saw movement. A shadow, or maybe a person, I couldn't be sure. It was quick, too quick to identify, and it disappeared behind the trees. My heart started pounding. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the movement, but there was nothing. Just the forest, silent and dark. I checked the doors and windows again, every lock secure. I wanted to call someone, but my phone had no signal. I was completely cut off. That night, I slept with the knife under my pillow and the hatchet on the floor beside the bed. Every sound was magnified. The wind, branches falling, the distant cry of an animal. It all set me on edge. I started marking the windows with chalk, small crosses, so I could see if any of them had been tampered with, to see if anyone had approached while I slept. The next morning, I found footprints in the soft dirt near the cabin. Not animal prints, these were human. Barefoot, heading toward the woods from the cabin, then circling back. I felt a cold dread. Someone had been here, someone had been close. The realization hit me hard. I was not alone in this forest. The isolation that I had craved was gone, replaced with fear and the knowledge that someone was observing me. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, avoiding the trail, staying close to the cabin, constantly scanning the forest through the windows. By the fifth night, I had established a routine. I kept the fire going, checked the locks repeatedly, and made sure to keep light and noise to a minimum. I realized that panic wouldn't help me. I needed a plan. I gathered what I could carry if I needed to leave in a hurry: water, some food, my backpack, the knife, flashlight, and rope. I even brought a thick blanket and the hatchet. I considered leaving earlier, but I wanted to make sure I had a clear path to the main road, and I needed daylight to navigate safely. I also thought about leaving signs, marking the trail behind me, so someone could find me if I didn't make it to the road. My mind worked frantically, mapping out every scenario, every escape route. That night, I didn't sit by the window. I stayed near the main door, listening, waiting. Hours passed. There were small noises, leaves crunching, the occasional snap of a branch, but nothing approached close enough to see. At one point, I thought I saw a figure between the trees, but when I focused, it was gone. Exhaustion hit me, and I finally drifted into a light, restless sleep with one eye half open, the knife clutched in my hand. Morning came with a cold, gray light. I went outside cautiously, scanning the perimeter. There were more footprints, and they were fresh. They led to the far side of the cabin and then back into the woods. Whoever it was, they were still around. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed everything essential, double-checked my supplies, and headed toward the road, moving as quietly as possible. The forest seemed to close in around me, each step tense, every rustle making my heart race. But I kept my head down, stayed on the trail, and maintained a steady pace. I didn't look back. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the main road. I flagged down a passing car, the first vehicle I had seen in days. I told them my situation briefly, trying not to lose my composure. They agreed to take me to the nearest town. Once there, I went to the local authorities and reported the footprints, the cabin, everything. They assured me they would investigate, and I learned later that the cabin had been a target before, used by trespassers or people hiding from the law. It wasn't haunted, it wasn't supernatural, just human. And that made it far scarier, knowing that someone else had been there, close enough to watch me, without me knowing until it was almost too late. The experience changed me. I never went back to that cabin. I stopped seeking isolation in the forest and learned to respect the dangers of the wilderness, not just from nature, but from other people. The fear I had felt in those nights stayed with me for months, a constant reminder of how fragile safety can be when you are alone and isolated. I never forgot the quiet, the darkness, the feeling of being watched, and I never forgot the relief I felt when I finally saw the road again, knowing I had made it out alive. Even now, I think about those nights. The forest looks peaceful from the outside, quiet and serene, but I know the truth. Danger can hide anywhere, and sometimes it hides in the most ordinary, normal places, like a small cabin in the woods. And the only way to survive is to stay alert, to be prepared, and never let your guard down, no matter how safe a place seems. I had been planning the trip for months. I needed to get away from everything, to disconnect, to escape the endless stress that had been building for years. Work had become unbearable. My apartment felt suffocating, and even the city itself seemed to weigh on me with its constant noise, traffic, and relentless crowd. The idea of a cabin alone in the woods, miles from anyone or anything, sounded like the only way to breathe again. I found a small place listed online, off a private dirt road in a remote part of northern Maine. Pictures showed a simple wooden cabin, rustic but well-kept, surrounded by dense forest with a small stream running nearby. There were no neighbors within sight. It was perfect, or so I thought. The drive there was longer than I expected. I left early in the morning, hoping to get there before nightfall. The highway eventually gave way to winding back roads, then to gravel paths, and finally to a narrow dirt track that twisted through thick pine forests. The air was colder than I anticipated, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and pine resin. I remember thinking how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural after so many years of city noise. No cars, no voices, no birds, just an oppressive, almost tangible silence. It should have felt peaceful, but something about it pressed on my chest, as if the forest itself was aware I had arrived. When I reached the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures. Small, made entirely of weathered wood, with a porch that wrapped around one side. The windows were clean, the door solid. I parked my car in the small clearing and stepped out. The cold air hit me sharply, and I inhaled deeply, trying to push away the unease that had settled in my stomach. I took my bags inside, checked the place thoroughly. It was clean and surprisingly well-stocked with basic supplies. Canned food, bottled water, a small propane stove, blankets, and even a first aid kit. The cabin had a tiny kitchen, a living space with a wood stove, and a small bedroom. Everything was simple, utilitarian, but it felt cozy. I unpacked my things slowly, arranging my backpack, the clothes I had brought, and the small box of personal items I had insisted on bringing. My laptop, a notebook, a few books. I decided to go for a walk before it got dark. The stream behind the cabin glistened faintly as the sun began to dip, and the trees cast long shadows across the forest floor. The forest seemed endless, a maze of trunks, fallen branches, and tangled undergrowth. I wandered for about an hour, following a small animal trail that ran parallel to the stream. Every so often, I would hear a distant snap of a branch or a rustle in the underbrush, but I didn't see anything. At first, it was just the sounds of wildlife, or so I told myself, but after a while, the noises seemed deliberate, as if something was following me just beyond the edge of vision. My heart started to race. I told myself it was absurd, that there was nothing to worry about, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I turned to go back, I realized the path had twisted in ways I hadn't noticed. The familiar landmarks I thought I had memorized were gone. The forest felt denser, darker, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally as the last light of the sun disappeared. I hurried back to the cabin, breaking into a jog, and I swore I heard footsteps behind me, echoing mine. But when I turned, there was nothing but the dense trees and the thickening darkness. I slammed the door behind me once I reached the cabin, my hands shaking, and bolted the lock. I tried to laugh it off as nerves, exhaustion, and paranoia, but sleep that night was difficult. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind against the walls, sounded like someone moving outside. The first morning was quiet, but the unease had not left me. I decided to explore a bit more, to understand the land around the cabin. There was a dirt path leading up a small incline behind the cabin, overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. I followed it, and eventually it opened into a small clearing with a partial view of the surrounding forest. I noticed faint tire tracks leading into the deeper woods, partially washed out by rain, but still discernible. The tracks were old, but recent enough to make me uneasy. Someone else had been back there, someone who could see the cabin as clearly as I could. My mind tried to rationalize it, hunters perhaps, or someone mapping the area, but the thought didn't reassure me. There was a human presence in the forest, close enough to notice me, and the thought made my stomach churn. As the days passed, I tried to settle into a routine. I chopped wood for the stove, cooked meals, explored the surrounding woods cautiously, and kept a journal. Each day, the forest seemed more alive, more watchful. Sometimes, I would wake in the middle of the night to hear the brush outside the cabin moving in ways that didn't match the wind. I convinced myself it was deer or other small animals. Other times, I would wake to the sound of distant hammering or scraping, like someone clearing brush or dragging something across the forest floor. My mind raced. I had no cell service here, no way to call for help if something went wrong. It was me, the cabin, and the endless forest. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that my isolation was playing tricks on my mind, but deep down, I knew the noises were real. Something was out there, and it wasn't small animals. On the fourth day, I decided to explore the stream that ran behind the cabin. I followed it upstream, moving carefully along the slippery rocks and damp earth. The forest closed in tighter here, the trees leaning over the water as if to block the light. About half a mile upstream, I found a small old shack, partially collapsed, hidden among the trees. I had never seen it in the photos or the listing. It looked abandoned, but not old enough to be forgotten. The wood was weathered, but there were signs of recent use. Footprints in the mud leading in and out, broken branches arranged along the path, a faint smell of smoke that hadn't yet dissipated. My heart pounded. Whoever was using that shack could have seen me at the cabin. The realization that someone had been close, possibly watching me, made my skin crawl. I retraced my steps quickly, glancing over my shoulder repeatedly. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. That night, I stayed inside and locked every door and window. I kept the lights low, only using the small stove for warmth. I sat in a chair facing the window that looked out into the clearing, trying to calm my racing heart. Every shadow cast by the moonlight looked like a person, every sound magnified. Around midnight, I heard something move in the clearing. The snap of a branch, the crunch of leaves. I froze, staring into the darkness. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to remind myself that this was wilderness, but instinct overrode reason. Whoever was out there was deliberate. The sound moved closer, to the edge of the tree line behind the cabin. I held my breath, willing myself to remain still. I had a small hunting knife I had brought, but I had no idea if it would do any good. The sound stopped suddenly, and the forest fell silent again, except for the wind. I waited hours, straining my ears, but heard nothing more. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, someone had left a small pile of sticks arranged in a crude circle. It wasn't elaborate, just sticks carefully placed in a pattern that could only have been done deliberately. No footprints nearby, no other signs of entry. Whoever had done this had left without leaving a trace. I felt exposed, trapped. The forest had become hostile, and the cabin, my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. I spent the day reinforcing the doors and windows, stacking firewood to make a barricade, and finding heavy objects I could use to secure entry points. Every noise outside made me jump. Every shadow set my nerves on fire. As the days went on, the intrusions escalated. Small things appeared inside the cabin. A stick wedged under the door handle, scratches on the wooden floor that hadn't been there before, and faint, muddy footprints that seemed to appear and disappear at random. Whoever was doing this was patient, careful, and deliberate. The realization made me terrified but also focused. I began to plan how I could leave safely. I considered hiking back the way I came, but the dirt road was miles away, and I wasn't sure if whoever had been watching me had blocked the path or was waiting. Leaving in daylight would make me visible. Leaving at night would be worse. I had to be smart. On the 7th day, I decided to act. I packed my bag quietly before dawn, leaving the cabin seemingly untouched. I stuffed my pockets with food and water and carried my small backpack. I waited until the first light of morning, then slipped out the back door, moving slowly through the clearing and into the forest. I stayed low, using the trees and undergrowth as cover, retracing my steps along the stream toward the old shack. I planned to move past it quickly, then cut diagonally across the forest to the main dirt road. My heart pounded constantly, every rustle of leaves making me flinch. After what felt like hours, I reached the shack. It was empty, but I could see signs of movement from the night before. Footprints in the mud, broken branches. I moved quickly, keeping my eyes on the forest floor to avoid stepping on noisy twigs. Finally, I reached the main dirt road. Relief washed over me, but I didn't stop. I ran along the road, careful to stay out of view from the dense tree line on either side. I could see a faint ribbon of smoke in the distance, possibly a house or farm. I headed toward it, waving my arms, hoping for a sign of life. Hours later, I reached a small farmhouse. The owners were startled at first, but immediately offered me food, water, and a phone. I called the local authorities and reported what had happened. They came out the next day to check the cabin. They found no one, but the tracks, the circles of sticks, and the signs of intrusion confirmed my story. Whoever had been there had disappeared, leaving no trace except for the small signs that made it clear I had been watched, that I had been in danger. I never returned to the cabin, and I never stayed in another remote cabin alone. In the weeks after, I struggled to process what had happened. The police never found the person who had been following me. The thought that someone could silently watch and manipulate my environment, patient enough to wait days and strike fear without confrontation, lingered. I realized how fragile the sense of safety we take for granted is. That experience changed me, made me hyper-aware of my surroundings, made me careful in ways I had never imagined. But I also learned something about myself. In the face of real danger, I could stay calm, observe carefully, and take action to protect myself. That knowledge, grim as it was, became a strange comfort, the one thing I could take away from the terrifying isolation of that cabin in the woods. Panic started to rise. I thought about running, but I also knew the terrain. Running blindly through dense forest could be more dangerous than walking calmly. I decided to backtrack slowly, keeping my eyes on the path ahead but aware of the sounds behind me. Every step made a branch snap underfoot, and I hated the sound it made, imagining it announcing my location. The steps behind me continued, keeping pace with me. I could hear the crunch of leaves, a subtle shift in the underbrush. I tried to convince myself again it was an animal, but something in the rhythm didn't match anything I had ever heard in the woods. I picked up the pace, moving quickly but carefully. Then I saw it, a flash of movement between the trees, just enough to catch my eye. Not an animal, a human figure, hunched slightly, moving quickly but not running, keeping pace with me. My heart leaped into my throat. I didn't stop this time. I ran, hurtling over roots, dodging low branches. My backpack caught on a tree, tearing slightly, but I kept moving. The steps behind me quickened. I didn't look back. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged, but it was impossible to hear anything else with the sound of my pounding feet. After what felt like forever, I broke through the trees into a small clearing. I recognized it. It was the creek I had passed earlier. Relief surged, and I almost stopped, but instinct told me not to. I ran along the bank, searching for the path that led back to the cabin. I could hear the figure behind me again, slower now, hesitant. The underbrush was wet, my boots slipping in mud, my legs burning with exhaustion. Finally, I saw it. The cabin, small and solitary, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. I sprinted the last stretch, reached the door, and locked it behind me. I pressed myself against the wood, chest heaving, listening. Outside, I could hear the forest, but the sound of deliberate footsteps had stopped. The wind moved through the trees, rustling leaves, but nothing else. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, my hands trembling, and checked all the doors and windows. Everything seemed fine, nothing broken, nothing forced. My mind tried to rationalize it. Someone could have been lost, someone could have been playing a prank, maybe even an animal, but nothing fit perfectly. The fear lingered, gnawing at me. Night fell slowly, bringing darkness that felt heavier than usual. I lit the stove, boiled water for tea, and tried to calm myself. I checked the locks repeatedly, peered through the windows, and kept the knife close. The forest outside was alive with sounds. Crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals, but none of it was human. I forced myself to eat, to drink, to breathe. The hours passed slowly. I slept fitfully, waking several times at the slightest noise, but morning eventually came, bringing a thin, cold light through the windows. I didn't leave the cabin that morning. I made breakfast, double-checked everything, and tried to calm my thoughts. I knew the forest could be disorienting, that fear could play tricks on the mind. But part of me remained cautious, aware that whatever had followed me the day before could still be nearby. I decided I needed to document everything. I wrote in a notebook, detailed the trail, the sounds, the movements. Writing helped calm me, gave me some sense of control. By the second day, I forced myself to leave. I moved along the trails with extreme care, sticking close to landmarks I could identify from the day before. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I maintained vigilance. My focus sharpened. Every snap, every rustle I noticed. I realized how disoriented and careless I had been on the first day, assuming the woods were safe simply because I had been there before. I moved slowly but deliberately, and by the end of the day, I returned to the cabin with a sense of cautious relief. The rest of the week passed slowly but uneventfully. I avoided the deep trails where I had felt the presence behind me. I stayed close to the cabin, explored the creek, watched wildlife, and spent long hours reading, thinking, and writing. I didn't feel safe in the same way I had initially imagined, but I adapted. I became hyper-aware, noticing details I had ignored before. Subtle sounds, shifts and shadows, the smell of earth and decay. When it came time to leave, I packed carefully, checking every lock and window. I left the cabin with a mix of relief and accomplishment. I had survived the fear, the unknown, the brush with something I couldn't fully explain. Driving back to civilization, the sun warm on my face, I felt tired but stronger, aware that the forest was unpredictable. Human presence alone wasn't always safe, and fear could be as real as the world around you. I didn't regret the trip, but I also knew I would never underestimate the isolation and the quiet of the woods again. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The city felt suffocating, and after weeks of relentless work, I craved silence, solitude, and the cold, clean air of the mountains. I had rented a small cabin that sat on the edge of a dense forest, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The listing had promised isolation, a wood stove, and a view of a small, frozen lake nearby. I had wanted nothing more than to escape, to be alone with my thoughts, the wind, and the faint creaking of the forest in winter. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the tall pines. The road to the cabin had been barely maintained. Snow crunched under my tires, and the frost had glazed the low-hanging branches, making the forest shimmer with an icy, brittle light. I parked in a small clearing near the cabin. From a distance, it looked charming. A small, dark log structure with a slanted roof, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. But as I walked closer, I noticed the overgrowth around the cabin. The way the snow seemed packed down in places unevenly, almost as though someone had been walking around here, though the listing had assured me I would be completely alone. I shook off the unease. I was tired, and my mind was probably exaggerating small things. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and cold, slightly damp air. It was sparsely furnished with a small kitchen area, a living space with a wood stove, and a loft bedroom. I unpacked my things quickly, making sure I had enough firewood stacked neatly beside the stove. Outside, the light was fading rapidly, and shadows stretched long across the uneven snow. I felt the first stirrings of that deep, prickly anxiety that sometimes comes with being completely alone in the wilderness. I told myself it was just the cold, just the isolation. I spent the evening gathering firewood, stacking it carefully, and getting a small fire started in the stove. The flames threw warm light across the cabin, and the sound of cracking would fill the quiet space. I made a simple dinner, canned soup and bread, and settled into a chair near the stove, staring out the frost-coated windows at the forest beyond. Darkness fell completely around the cabin. The forest became a wall of black, tall shapes that creaked and whispered in the wind. I was alone, truly alone, and the first real pang of fear hit me. Not because of anything tangible, but because of the possibility of something happening with no one to help me. That night, I went to bed with the fire still burning low. Sleep came unevenly, punctuated by small noises outside. The crack of a branch under snow, the scrape of something against the cabin wall. Every sound made my heart rate spike. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. There was a sound, a faint thump, almost like a heavy footstep, outside the cabin. My first instinct was to dismiss it as the wind or an animal, but the thumps came again, slow and deliberate, moving along the side of the cabin. I stayed still, straining my ears, heart hammering. The thumps stopped. I could feel the weight of the isolation pressing in. My mind raced, thinking of all the ways someone could have reached the cabin without being noticed. The main road was difficult enough that it would have taken hours. But then I remembered the faint paths through the trees, the overgrown tracks I had seen on the drive-in. Someone could have been hiding, watching. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a raccoon or a deer. The rational part of me fought the panic that wanted to grip me. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to a restless, shallow sleep. Morning came slow. I woke to a gray, overcast sky and the faint smell of wet snow. I got up, fed the fire, and stepped outside to clear the snow from the porch. As I did, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the trees to the cabin. They were human, too large to be mine. I had walked around the clearing after parking, and there had been no prints. These were fresh, and they ended at the porch. Panic rose in me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing appeared broken. I took a deep breath and told myself I had probably imagined the sounds and seen prints that were old or made by someone else passing by, though I knew deep down that explanation didn't fit. The day passed in a tense blur. I did my best to keep busy, chopping more wood, exploring the small lake nearby, and stocking up on firewood. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of branches, made me flinch. By nightfall, I was exhausted, and yet sleep felt impossible. I stayed by the stove, keeping the fire high, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. A thump, this time on the roof. My stomach sank. I grabbed the small axe I had brought for chopping wood, holding it tightly as I crept toward the window. Snow was falling lightly now, and the dark forest seemed even more oppressive. The sound came again, someone walking carefully, deliberately on the roof. My heart pounded. I stayed crouched behind the window, holding my breath, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. Then I heard a scraping sound along the side of the cabin, near the back, like someone was trying to get inside. My first instinct was to run, but I knew there was nowhere to go. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and my phone had almost no signal. My mind raced through all the options. I could hide in the loft, barricade myself, or try to confront whoever it was. I chose to barricade. I pulled the heavier furniture in front of the doors, jammed the windows as best I could, and kept the axe ready. Hours passed like this, every minute stretching endlessly. I stayed awake, barely breathing, listening to the snow falling and the faint noises outside. Eventually, in the early morning hours, the noises stopped. I was trembling, drenched in sweat despite the cold. I didn't sleep again that night. When the first pale light of dawn came, I cautiously went outside. The snow was undisturbed except for footprints leading to the cabin from the trees, and then, importantly, leading back into the woods. Whoever had been there had left. There were no signs of attempted entry beyond the light scraping at the back door, but the fear lingered, making my hands shake as I packed my things to leave. I didn't want to stay another night. I left the cabin as quickly as I could, retracing my path to the road. Every snap of a branch under my tires, every rustle in the forest, made me glance nervously into the trees. When I reached the nearest town, I reported the incident to the local sheriff. They took my statement seriously, though there had been no other reports of break-ins in the area recently. They assured me that I had done everything right, that some trespassers were opportunistic, looking for remote cabins to explore or rob. The rational part of me tried to absorb that reassurance, but the memory of being watched, of those deliberate steps on the roof, stayed with me for months. I returned home, and slowly, life returned to normal. I avoided remote cabins for a long time after that, sticking to places where other people were around. Eventually, though, I forced myself to go back to nature, but with a new respect for the isolation, the vulnerability it could bring, and the reality that some dangers were human, not supernatural. The cabin had been a lesson in fear, not the kind that comes from imagination, but from understanding that being truly alone, exposed, and unprepared could make anyone feel powerless. I started preparing differently after that. Whenever I went into remote areas, I always brought extra supplies, made sure my communication devices worked, and avoided going alone. I also learned to observe subtle signs around me. The disturbed snow, footprints, shadows at the edges of my vision. Those things could be more important than any emergency kit or survival guide. Months later, I returned to the forest, but not to the same cabin. I found another trail, another area, but I never again felt the same naive trust in the quiet. Now, when I step into the woods, I am alert, watching, aware of every sound and movement. I can't shake the memory of that night, the feeling of someone outside, walking, watching, thinking I was unaware. The memory doesn't haunt me in a supernatural way, but it reminds me of how real fear can be, how vulnerable we are when alone, and how quickly solitude can turn from peaceful to terrifying. In the end, I survived unharmed physically, but the experience changed me. I learned to respect the forest, to respect isolation, and to prepare for the unexpected. The cabin, the snow, the footsteps, and the long, tense hours of night taught me something I couldn't unlearn. Fear is not always born of imagination. Sometimes, it is born of reality, quiet, patient, and waiting. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will, but I carry the lesson with me in every wilderness trip I take. Every step, every snap of a branch, every shadow reminds me to be cautious, aware, and prepared. That night, that cabin, and those footsteps taught me that being alone doesn't make you free. It makes you vulnerable, and vigilance is the only protection. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, and I thought I had planned everything perfectly. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest road, with only a narrow dirt path winding its way through the thick forest. I had rented it online, seeing only a few pictures that made it seem rustic but comfortable. The reviews were solid, though sparse, which I took as a good sign that it was off the beaten path, just the way I wanted. My mind was set on isolation, on the chance to disconnect from the noise of the city, the emails, the constant hum of people, and just be alone in nature for a while. The drive there was long and rough. My old car groaned up the uneven terrain, the tires crunching over gravel, then dirt, and finally mud after the last rainstorm. The GPS lost signal several times, leaving me to rely on the barely visible signs that marked the path. By the time I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was low in the sky. Its last rays spilled through the trees, painting the forest in dull gold and long shadows that seemed to stretch and move as I looked at them. The cabin itself was small, a single story made of dark, weathered logs. The roof had patches where the wood was worn thin, but it seemed solid. A stone chimney jutted from one side, though I doubted it had been used recently. There was a small wooden porch with a few chairs stacked on top of each other and a woodpile neatly arranged against the side. The door had a basic lock, but it clicked open easily with the key I had been given. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of dust, damp wood, and something else I couldn't quite identify at first. Old oil lamps sat on a table, and a small stove stood in the corner, blackened from soot. A single bed with a thin mattress and a worn quilt took up one corner of the room. There was a small bathroom with a sink and a shower, though the water came from a tank, and I had learned quickly that it would only last for a short while. I unpacked slowly, carefully placing my things on the floor and the small shelf near the bed. Everything seemed quiet, almost too quiet. There were no sounds of animals, no wind rustling the trees, just the soft hum of the forest in the distance. I brushed it off, thinking my imagination was already running wild from the isolation. I spent the first evening exploring the area immediately around the cabin. There was a small creek nearby, its water moving quickly over rocks, and a clearing just beyond the trees that gave a view of the surrounding hills. I took a mental note of the terrain, imagining the paths I could take for short hikes the next day. The sun set quickly, and soon the forest was swallowed by darkness. I lit a few of the oil lamps, which cast a warm, flickering glow against the walls, and tried to get comfortable with the idea of being completely alone. The first night was strange, though not alarming at first. I kept waking up to little noises, the creak of the cabin settling, the rustle of leaves against the windows, but I told myself it was normal. By midnight, however, the noises had changed. There was a rhythmic thumping outside, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. I froze, straining to hear, and the sound stopped. Minutes later, I heard it again, slower this time, closer. I sat up, gripping my phone for light and a sense of security, even though the signal was weak and unreliable. The thought that someone, or something, was outside made my stomach tighten. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest road was miles away, and my only option would be to navigate the dark forest alone. By the second night, the sense of unease had settled in like a weight. I stayed awake most of the night, listening, occasionally catching glimpses of movement outside the windows. Branches swayed, shadows shifted, and I could hear something heavy brushing against the sides of the cabin. I told myself it was just a deer, or a raccoon, or maybe even the wind, but my instincts screamed at me that it was something else. The next morning, I decided to take a walk further into the forest to distract myself, to convince my mind that the sounds and shadows were just natural, not threatening. The forest was dense, the path I chose barely visible under fallen leaves and moss. Birds chirped high in the canopy, and sunlight filtered through the branches in long streaks. It should have been peaceful, but every crack of a branch underfoot made me jump. After a few hours of walking, I returned to the cabin, exhausted but relieved. The isolation was starting to feel heavier, pressing down on me in a way I hadn't expected. By the third night, the cabin felt like it had become a trap. The noises had grown louder, more deliberate. There were scratches on the porch, small but deep gouges in the wood that hadn't been there before. I checked the locks obsessively, moved furniture against the doors, and even placed the small firewood log against the main entrance, though I knew it wouldn't stop someone determined. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the low groan of the wind, made me flinch and reach for a weapon I didn't have. My imagination churned out every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. I started to notice little things missing. A bottle of water I had left on the counter was gone. A bag of snacks had been opened and partially eaten. I knew I hadn't done it, and the idea that someone had been inside the cabin while I was gone, or maybe even while I was inside, asleep, made me feel my stomach turn over. I searched the cabin thoroughly, checking every corner and hiding place, but there was no one. Nothing else was out of place. I began to doubt myself, questioning if I was imagining things, if the isolation was messing with my mind. On the fourth day, I decided to take a short hike down to the creek to clear my head. The forest was beautiful, almost painfully so, with sunlight glinting off the water and moss hanging from the trees. But even in the open, I felt eyes on me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, hearing footsteps that matched my pace but were never there when I looked. The fear that had been a gnawing discomfort in the back of my mind became a constant pulse, a rhythm I couldn't escape. Returning to the cabin that evening, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it. I pushed it open slowly, scanning the interior. Everything looked normal at first glance, but the smell was different now. A metallic tang in the air, faint but unmistakable. I felt my pulse spike, and I moved through the cabin cautiously. Then I saw it. Scratches along the inside of the doorframe, deeper than any I had seen before, and footprints in the dust on the floor, barefoot, small, and not mine. Panic set in. I realized then that I wasn't alone, and that the idea of leaving the cabin in the dark forest was now terrifying. I spent the night huddled in the corner of the bed, listening, too afraid to even breathe loudly. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound was amplified. I imagined a person or multiple people watching, waiting, deciding whether to come in. I barely slept. The next day, I forced myself to think logically. I couldn't stay there. The cabin was unsafe. I packed everything quickly, making sure to leave nothing behind that could be stolen. As I stepped outside, I noticed tracks in the dirt, large, booted footprints that led from the forest to the cabin and back. Someone had been coming and going, watching me, and possibly even staying nearby without my knowledge. I started walking toward the nearest road, sticking to the shallow creek where the ground was uneven and the forest thick, hoping it would hide my movements. The forest seemed endless. I lost track of time, keeping my focus on moving as quietly as possible. My phone had 1 bar of signal now, and I called the local authorities as soon as I could, explaining my location and situation. They told me to stay put and keep moving toward a visible road, that someone would be coming to pick me up. I walked for hours, the forest growing darker and colder. The sounds I had feared seemed almost alive now. Twigs snapping behind me, branches brushing against each other with unnatural timing. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I froze, but nothing happened. I tried to keep my breathing steady, focusing only on the path ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged onto a narrow dirt road. My legs shook from exhaustion and fear. I saw a car approaching in the distance, headlights cutting through the trees. I ran toward it, waving frantically. The driver stopped, and I collapsed into the vehicle, shaking uncontrollably. I explained everything to the authorities when they arrived, and they organized a search of the area. The cabin was abandoned, but signs of someone living nearby temporarily were clear. Small fires had been made in the woods, a makeshift shelter of branches, and various supplies hidden in the underbrush. Whoever had been there was gone, but the thought of being watched, of being so close to someone with unknown intentions, stayed with me for weeks afterward. It took months before I could feel comfortable being alone in nature again. The cabin had been supposed to be a place of peace, but it became a memory of fear, of constant alertness, of isolation pushing my mind to the edge. I never went back, and I never rented a remote cabin again. Eventually, I moved on, but the experience left its mark. I installed security systems in my home, and I learned to trust my instincts when something felt off. Most importantly, I realized that fear can be just as real as any danger when you're alone, and sometimes the most frightening things aren't supernatural, they're human. I had always liked the idea of isolation, the kind that wasn't romanticized in books or movies, the kind that forced you to pay attention to the ordinary details you usually ignored. After years of city life, with the constant hum of traffic and the blur of people passing by, I needed a place where the world could not touch me. The cabin I found was tucked away in a dense stretch of forest in the northern mountains. A small wooden structure that had been abandoned for years but still stood solid, weathered but uncompromised. I had rented it through a local site, more out of desperation for silence than comfort. The drive up was long and winding, the asphalt fading into gravel, the trees pressing closer on either side. By the time I reached the last bend, the cabin was visible between the trunks, its roof dark and the wood gray with age. I parked my car on a small clearing that had once been a yard. The place had no power, no running water, and I knew that. I had prepared for it. Candles, bottled water, a small camping stove, and a stack of firewood piled in the corner of the porch. The air smelled sharp, like wet earth and decaying leaves. I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath my weight. The smell of mold and old pine hit me immediately as I opened the door. Inside, the cabin was bare. A table and 2 chairs sat in the center, a small fireplace against the far wall, and a narrow bed in the corner covered in a thin, dust-coated mattress. The windows were grimy, letting in muted light, and the floorboards were uneven. I spent the first few hours cleaning and arranging things, trying to make it feel livable. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the smoke curling upward and filling the room with the warm scent of burning wood. Outside, the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The first night passed without incident, though I barely slept. The forest was darker than I had expected. At one point, I thought I heard something moving just outside the cabin, a scraping or crunching on the leaves. I sat up, heart racing, listening. Nothing happened. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, anything but human. But even thinking it felt like a lie. The next morning, I went outside to explore. The trees were thick, and the sunlight barely reached the ground. Moss covered rocks and the bases of the trunks, and the forest smelled damp and alive. I walked along a narrow trail I found behind the cabin, leading deeper into the woods. The trail was overgrown in places, the underbrush thick, and I had to push branches aside. I realized quickly that I had no clear sense of direction. The forest had no sound beyond the occasional bird or snapping twig. I felt the first flicker of true unease, the sense that I was alone in a place that could swallow me without effort. I returned to the cabin as the sun began to dip, bringing with it a heavy, shadowed chill. The firewood I had stacked was nearly empty, and I realized I hadn't checked my food supply properly. My small cooler contained enough for a couple of days, but I hadn't brought anything to last longer. I decided to take a short walk to the nearest creek I had seen on the map to fill my water bottles. The forest thickened, and the trail became harder to follow. Every few minutes, I would stop to listen, convinced I could hear something moving behind me, something that didn't sound like an animal. My pulse quickened with each step. When I reached the creek, the water ran clear and cold. I knelt and filled my bottles, trying to ignore the tight feeling in my chest. On my way back, the sun was nearly gone, and the forest seemed to close in. Shadows lengthened, and I realized I was no longer entirely certain which way led back to the cabin. Panic started to rise, that irrational fear that creeps in when isolation meets uncertainty. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The undergrowth, the moss-covered rocks, the trees, all of it blended into an unbroken green and brown pattern. I walked faster, branches slapping my arms, thorns tearing at my jacket. My feet slipped on wet leaves, and I stumbled, scraping my hands. I stopped to catch my breath, realizing my hands were shaking. I was not far from the cabin, I told myself. I had to be, but the forest had swallowed all familiar markers. The creek ran somewhere behind me, the path I had followed lost beneath the dimming light. I took a deep breath, forcing my mind to focus. I marked a tree with a piece of my jacket to remember the spot and continued, trying to calm the rising fear. Night fell completely before I found my way back to the cabin. My body was sore, my hands scratched, my clothes torn. The cabin, when I finally saw it through the blackness, was a relief, but also a stark reminder of my vulnerability. I locked the door, though there was nothing to keep out, and sat by the fireplace, staring at the flickering flames. The shadows on the walls moved with the fire, and every sound from outside, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, made me jump. I realized I had never been truly alone before. Not like this. Not in a place where a single misstep could leave me completely unprotected. The next day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I collected firewood and water from a small barrel someone had left behind. I inspected the perimeter, noting the weaknesses in the structure and shoring them up as best I could. The isolation was pressing but manageable. I thought about my options if something went wrong. The nearest town was a half-hour drive. The nearest neighbors were miles away. I felt a gnawing sense of being trapped, not in the cabin itself, but in the idea of being cut off from help. On the third day, the sense of unease became more pronounced. I kept hearing noises, small but distinct. Footsteps on the gravel outside, faint knocking against the walls, the sound of something sliding along the boards of the porch. Every time I checked, nothing was there. I started noticing small details that I hadn't before. Footprints in the dirt outside, though I was certain I had seen no one. Marks on the porch railing, subtle scratches that hadn't been there before. My imagination began to play tricks, and I had to remind myself that there was no one else out here. Or so I hoped. That night, the sounds became more pronounced. Something shifted outside the cabin. I could hear it walking slowly around the perimeter, the rhythm of its movement distinct against the quiet. I could no longer convince myself it was an animal. The sound was deliberate. I crouched by the window, watching the darkness, straining to see through the thick shadows. A branch scraped against the cabin wall, and I flinched. The noise stopped. Then it started again somewhere else. I realized I could not see it, could not know its intentions, and that terror sank deep into my chest. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the fire, watching the flames, listening to the quiet punctuated by irregular noises outside. Hours passed, slow and merciless. Every so often, I would step outside holding a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing, only trees, leaves, and the pale outline of the cabin in the moonlight. I considered leaving immediately, driving back to civilization. But the roads were treacherous at night, the gravel loose and slick. I had no cell service to call anyone. I was completely alone. The night seemed endless, each minute stretching into eternity. Exhaustion and fear made my thoughts race. I imagined someone out there, watching me, waiting for a moment of weakness. Every sound, every shadow, became amplified in my mind. I realized that fear itself was now a predator, stalking me more relentlessly than anything human or animal. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the dirty windows, I was trembling, physically and mentally drained. I had stayed awake the entire night, alert to every detail, every sound. In the morning, I resolved to reclaim some sense of control. I packed a bag with essentials: water, food, a flashlight, the first aid kit, and decided to walk toward the main road, keeping the cabin within view. The forest in daylight was less menacing but still thick and challenging. I moved carefully, marking my path, watching for signs of whatever had been around the cabin the previous night. Hours passed and I saw no one. The forest, I realized, was neutral, indifferent. It had not been against me, nor for me. Fear had filled in the blanks with imagined threats. When I finally reached the road, the sense of relief was profound. I saw a car approaching and waved until it stopped. The driver, surprised but kind, offered a ride. The entire time, I kept looking back toward the forest, toward the cabin. I realized that while nothing had physically harmed me, the psychological toll had been significant. The isolation, the uncertainty, the vulnerability. It had all compounded into a terror that felt almost tangible. Back in town, safe and among people, I thought about the cabin. I knew I would never return. The experience had taught me the limits of comfort, the fragility of human perception when removed from society, and the subtle terror of absolute solitude. I documented everything I had seen, every sound, every fear, so that I could process it. In the weeks that followed, I gradually regained a sense of normalcy. Sleep returned. I stopped imagining footsteps behind me in empty rooms. But the memory of those nights, the cold, the darkness, the sense of being watched by an unseen presence, stayed with me. In retrospect, the experience was valuable, frightening as it was. It showed me that fear can be manufactured by circumstance, magnified by isolation, and that our minds are capable of turning ordinary elements, rustling leaves, shadows, wind, into profound terror. I came away with a deep respect for the quiet, for the wild, and for the reality that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but our own minds reacting to the rawness of nature. And for the first time in years, I felt truly alive in my awareness of how fragile control can be, and how precious human contact and civilization are, even in their noisy, cluttered forms. I had been planning the trip for months, meticulously gathering supplies, checking maps, and watching weather forecasts. I needed a break from everything. The endless noise of the city, the stress of work, the suffocating sameness of daily life. The cabin I rented was far off the main roads, deep in the woods of a mountainous region I had never been to before. It was the kind of place that promised isolation, quiet, and a chance to disappear from the world for a few days. I told myself it would be restorative, even if a little challenging. I liked that idea. I wanted to test myself. The drive up was long, much longer than I anticipated. The GPS kept recalculating, trying to find alternate routes as the roads narrowed and the pavement turned to dirt. At some points, trees pressed close on either side, branches scratching the car windows like fingernails. The sun was already low when I finally reached the last turnoff, a barely visible trail into the forest. I parked the car and looked around. The cabin wasn't immediately visible. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and started down the narrow path, a soft crunch of dead leaves underfoot my only sound. The cabin came into view as I rounded a bend. It was older than I expected, wooden and weathered, tucked into a slight clearing. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though I was the only one scheduled to be there. I assumed it had been lit to make the place welcoming, perhaps by a caretaker who had stopped by earlier. The structure itself was modest. One story, a slanted roof, a porch with a rocking chair that had clearly seen better days. Windows were dark, reflecting the forest around them. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of old wood and faint mildew greeted me. Dust motes floated in the beams of the fading sunlight. Everything was quiet. I set my backpack down and ran my fingers over the surfaces. The furniture was minimal. A small table, a couple of chairs, a bed in the corner, and a wood stove against one wall. The cabin had no electricity. Everything was powered by candles or the stove. The walls were bare, and there was only one small cabinet that seemed to hold some basic kitchen supplies. I unpacked my things slowly, careful not to rush, because the quiet was so complete it made every movement seem amplified. The rustling of the leaves outside sounded unnaturally loud. The distant creak of trees shifting in the wind felt like footsteps. I made a small fire in the stove, using the kindling I had brought, and sat down near it. Heat spread slowly, giving the room a comforting warmth that contrasted sharply with the chill settling in my bones from being outside. I decided to make a simple dinner: canned soup, bread, and some jerky. Even in the dim light, I noticed how silent the forest had become. The birds had gone quiet, the wind had slowed, and only the faint rustle of distant branches remained. I ate slowly, listening. That's when I first heard the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but I caught it. A snapping, soft but deliberate, like a branch breaking under weight. My stomach tightened. I reminded myself it was probably a deer or some small animal, but the noise didn't stop. It moved around the cabin, circling it, stopping and starting. My imagination started filling in gaps, painting possibilities that didn't exist, but my gut told me to take it seriously. I tried to ignore it and cleaned up after dinner, stacking dishes in the cabinet and sweeping a small patch of floor. But the sounds continued. Occasionally, I would catch movement outside the window, shadows flickering between the trees. I told myself it was the wind, playing tricks with the branches. Yet, there was something deliberate in the pattern of the noise. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, slow, and careful. Whoever or whatever it was knew I was there. Night fell fully, and darkness pressed against the cabin walls. I lit a few candles and kept the fire going, though the glow didn't reach far. The snapping outside grew louder, closer, more frequent. I picked up a heavy metal flashlight and a small hatchet I kept for chopping wood. I checked the locks on the doors. Everything was secure, but the feeling of vulnerability refused to leave me. I stayed in the living area near the stove where I could see the door and the window to the porch. Hours passed. The snapping didn't stop. Sometimes it would pause, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. I stayed awake, shifting from one position to another, trying to convince myself I was safe. I thought about leaving, driving back down the dirt trail to the main road, but the thought of walking back in complete darkness without clear visibility was just as unnerving. The idea of facing someone or something outside was terrifying. Then came the movement at the window. I had been staring at the dark glass, trying to convince myself I saw nothing, when a figure appeared briefly, pressed against the far edge of the frame. My heart slammed in my chest. The outline was human, tall, wearing dark clothes. It didn't move like an animal. I gripped the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, trying to remain unseen. The figure lingered for a moment and then stepped back into the shadows. I realized then that this wasn't just an animal. Someone had been watching me. I remembered reading online about isolated cabins and people who used them as targets for robberies or worse. Panic began to rise, but I forced myself to think rationally. The cabin had only one main entrance. If someone wanted to get in, they had to go through the door or break a window. I checked the locks again and considered barricading the door with furniture. I spent the night awake, barely sleeping. Every sound, every crack of a branch, made me flinch. I stayed near the fire, hatchet in hand, listening, waiting, trying to convince myself that dawn would bring safety. When morning finally arrived, I dared to look outside. The forest seemed normal in daylight, peaceful almost, but I could see footprints in the soft dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. Someone had circled the cabin during the night, moving carefully but deliberately, leaving clear evidence that they had been there. I packed quickly, not wanting to linger another second. I left the cabin door locked but didn't bother barricading it this time. I carried my backpack, flashlight, and hatchet, walking briskly down the dirt trail, constantly scanning the trees. Every shadow, every rustle made me jump. I kept telling myself the roads would be safer, that the presence of other people meant security. Halfway down the trail, I heard snapping behind me again. I froze. I listened. The sound was deliberate, methodical. Someone was following me, keeping to the cover of the trees. My heart rate spiked. I considered running, but the path was narrow and uneven. I started moving faster, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. The sound didn't stop. Branches broke at intervals, always behind me, never directly on the trail. I realized that whoever it was had been shadowing me, not approaching directly, keeping hidden but making sure I knew they were there. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks, my flashlight swinging wildly, casting shadows that made the forest feel alive and threatening. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I forced myself forward. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only half an hour, I reached the main road. It was empty but safer somehow. I ran until I could see a car in the distance and waved desperately. The driver slowed and stopped. I told them I had been followed, didn't stop to explain fully, and they agreed to drive me to the nearest town. Once I was in town, surrounded by people and lights, the panic ebbed slightly. I called the local authorities to report the incident, providing the location of the cabin and describing the footprints and the person I had seen. They told me they would investigate, but nothing more was immediately available. The thought that someone had been so deliberate, so patient, staying near the cabin without ever making contact, lingered in my mind. It was terrifying. Over the next few days, I stayed in town, avoiding returning to the cabin. I couldn't stop thinking about it, imagining the scenario repeating itself, imagining how close I had come to confrontation. The authorities eventually reported back that no one was found at the cabin. No traces except for the footprints. It was as if the person had disappeared, leaving only the memory of their presence. I realized then how careful I needed to be with isolation, how easily something could go wrong when you are truly alone. I had gone into the woods thinking it would be a retreat, a safe place to be with myself, but it turned out that isolation carried risks I hadn't considered. I learned to respect the environment, the unpredictability of humans, and the fragility of safety when you are completely alone. Eventually, I returned to the city, back to normal life, but I carried the experience with me. I started preparing differently for trips, thinking about exits, safety, and contingencies. I never stayed in a remote cabin alone again, and I never ignored the sounds around me. That incident stayed with me for years, a reminder that fear isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about reality and how unprepared we can be for the people and situations we might encounter when we step into isolation. I sometimes think about the footprints around that cabin, about the deliberate steps that circled it, and I shiver. But I also know that I survived because I paid attention, because I stayed alert, because I respected the threat and didn't take chances. The cabin remains in my mind as a lesson, and even though I have revisited other remote places since then, I do so with a careful mind, a watchful eye, and an awareness that isolation can be beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. That trip, terrifying as it was, ended clearly, without incident beyond the fear itself. I returned home, shaken but alive, and in that clarity, in the fact that I made it out, I found a strange comfort. The fear was real, the danger had been real, and surviving it had been a conscious choice. That awareness has stayed with me, shaping how I approach every remote adventure, every isolated cabin, every step into the unknown. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. My work had been unbearable, with endless deadlines and meetings that seemed to exist only to make me feel small. My apartment, cluttered and noisy, was a cage I wanted to escape from. So when I finally decided to take a weekend off and go to a cabin deep in the woods, I felt relief the moment I booked it. The cabin wasn't luxurious, just a small wooden structure tucked away from the road, miles from the nearest town. But it promised peace, silence, and the kind of solitude that can heal or, I would later realize, test the mind in ways nothing else could. The drive there was long. The city gradually gave way to small towns, then to roads surrounded by dense forests. As the hours passed, the signs of civilization became fewer. Gas stations appeared only rarely, and cell service disappeared entirely. That sense of isolation, which had once thrilled me, began to feel heavier with every mile. I told myself it was part of the experience. The quiet, the stillness, the emptiness. By the time I reached the turnoff to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, and shadows spread long and black across the road. The cabin was exactly as described in the listing. A small wooden building, roughly 20 feet by 20 feet, with a steep roof and a small porch out front. It had a single door, 2 windows, and a stone chimney. I parked the car beside the cabin, unloaded my bag, and carried it inside. The interior smelled of dust, wood, and the faint lingering aroma of someone else's cooking. Everything was old but solid. The floor creaked under my weight, and the furniture, rough wooden chairs, a small table, and a bed with a thin mattress, looked worn but serviceable. There was a small wood stove, a stack of firewood, and a bucket of water, as the listing had mentioned no running water. It was simple, but it would do. It had to do. I spent the first hour unpacking, organizing my things, and taking stock of the cabin. The windows looked out onto thick forest in all directions, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground as the sun set. Birds chirped their last calls before darkness fell, and I felt a thrill of excitement at being so far from everything familiar. I made a small fire in the stove, lit a lantern, and ate a simple meal I had brought with me. The warmth of the cabin contrasted sharply with the cold that had begun to creep in outside, and I settled in for the night feeling content and safe. The first night passed quietly. I slept soundly in the thin mattress, waking only briefly when the wind rattled the windows or a branch scraped against the roof. But the next day, as soon as the sun rose, I noticed something strange. The woods were quieter than usual. Birds had stopped singing, and the forest, though still alive, felt absent of the usual small movements. I chalked it up to it being early morning and the woods adjusting to the day. I spent the day exploring nearby trails, noting the streams, rocks, and the dense undergrowth. It was beautiful but also intimidating in a way I hadn't anticipated. I reminded myself constantly that I was safe. I had prepared and the cabin was solid. By the second night, things started to shift. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. I noticed the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps were deliberate, slow, and heavy. They stopped whenever I moved to a window and started again when I returned to my chair. My stomach twisted with unease. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was tired, and the isolation was playing tricks on me. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, tried to make myself comfortable by the fire, and told myself I would sleep. But I didn't sleep well. Every small noise startled me. Twigs snapping underfoot, the wind brushing against the windows, the occasional thud of something in the distance. I could hear it all. I kept the lantern lit, even though it was supposed to conserve fuel. Shadows on the walls seemed to move unnaturally, stretching and shifting. I convinced myself it was just the flickering fire. My mind was making shapes in the dark. That had to be it. The third day, I attempted to distract myself with more exploration. I wandered farther than the previous day, following a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The trail eventually ended at a small clearing with a pond in the center. The water was still and dark, reflecting the trees like a black mirror. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, feeling the sun on my skin. It was peaceful and terrifying at the same time. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something else. The firewood I had stacked neatly outside had been disturbed. A log was out of place, another one slightly shifted. My heart thumped. I hadn't been gone long enough for an animal to move them this precisely. I picked up the logs, replaced them carefully, and tried not to think too much of it. That night, the footsteps returned. They were closer this time, circling the cabin. My sleep was fitful, broken by the constant sound. I kept the lantern burning, moving it from window to window, trying to see what was out there. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything except those steps. And then I noticed something even worse. Scratches on the door. Small, jagged marks as if someone or something had tried to get in. I examined them with trembling hands. They were fresh. The wood splintered slightly where each mark had landed. I realized I was not imagining it. Something was outside, and it had been watching me. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think. I had a survival mindset, years of hiking and camping experience that told me to stay calm, to assess the situation. I barricaded the door with the heaviest furniture I could find, moved the chairs to the windows to prevent them from opening, and prepared for the night as best as I could. I kept a knife close at hand and a hatchet by the bed. I told myself I had to be practical. Fear would not help me. The night was long. The sounds outside didn't stop. The footsteps circled endlessly, sometimes stopping for long periods before starting again. I could hear branches breaking in the distance, twigs snapping closer and closer, as if someone was moving silently but deliberately through the trees. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake, listening, waiting, imagining all the ways this could go wrong. Hours passed like days. By the morning, I was exhausted but alive. I peered outside cautiously. The snow, which had begun to fall lightly the previous evening, covered the footprints. But there were other signs. More scratches on the wood near the windows, deep depressions in the snow around the cabin, and something that made my stomach drop: a set of prints leading away from the cabin into the forest. They weren't large, not particularly deep, but human. Someone had been here, had circled the cabin, and then left. I could only guess why, but I knew I was being watched. I spent the day preparing. I gathered every bit of firewood, secured the windows and doors with extra planks and furniture, and created a perimeter of sorts around the cabin. I made sure the axe and knife were always within reach. I checked the roads, the trails, the surrounding area. No one was in sight, but I felt the weight of the forest pressing closer. Each time the wind moved, it sounded like someone breathing. Each shadow seemed too deliberate to be random. The next night, it happened again. The footsteps returned, louder this time, deliberate, sometimes pacing and sometimes pausing. But there was something new. I could hear low whispers in the wind, almost human, though I couldn't make out the words. My heart raced. My breathing was heavy. I stayed near the stove, close to the fire, holding the knife and hatchet. Every noise set my nerves on fire. I thought of leaving, but the snow had become heavy, and the car was buried several feet deep, impossible to reach. I was trapped. By morning, I knew I had to take action. I couldn't sit and wait for whoever or whatever was out there. I spent the day gathering supplies, packing what I could carry. I made a plan to leave at nightfall, following the road as best I could, even though it was barely visible under the snow. I documented everything I could, leaving marks to retrace my steps, and prepared myself for the cold, the darkness, and the possibility that someone might be following me. When the evening came, I set out. I left the cabin quietly, carrying only the essentials, moving as silently as I could. The snow made every step exhausting, but it also muffled my sound. I followed the road, following faint tracks and the outlines of trees, careful to avoid leaving a straight path that could be easily tracked. Hours passed. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything except the wind and my own heavy breathing. Slowly, as the night deepened, I began to feel a sense of cautious hope. I was making progress. I would get out. I would survive this. After what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance, the faint glow of a small town. Relief crashed over me. I moved faster, stumbling through snowdrifts, ignoring exhaustion and fear. I reached the first houses just as the night was ending. Someone noticed me, called for help, and I was finally safe. The authorities came, checked the area, and I explained everything. They found tracks around the cabin, confirmed it was someone human, but they never caught them. I never went back to the cabin. I never wanted to, but I remembered everything. The sounds, the isolation, the terror of being hunted in a place that had seemed safe, the endless dark, the feeling that the trees themselves were watching. That cabin, that forest, taught me something I had never truly understood before. Fear is not always about the supernatural. Sometimes it is about isolation, about knowing someone could be watching and feeling utterly powerless. It is about being completely alone with your instincts, with your mind racing, with nothing to help you but your own wits. I survived, and that was enough. I left the woods behind, but I carry that night with me. The feeling of being hunted, of being small and helpless in a world that offers no comfort, stayed with me forever. I don't speak about it much. I don't return, but I remember it every time I am alone in a quiet room, or hear footsteps in the dark, or feel the shadows moving when no one is there. It took weeks for me to feel normal again. I learned to sleep without panic. I avoided forests and cabins in remote places. I rebuilt my life slowly, but I never forgot. And while life returned to ordinary rhythms, a small part of me remained alert, aware that danger can come quietly, invisibly, from someone who blends with the world you trust. The forest had taught me this lesson brutally, and I would carry it with me for the rest of my life. I had always been drawn to the idea of solitude in the wilderness. The noise and stress of the city felt suffocating, and I longed for a place where the only sounds were the wind, the trees, and the occasional bird. After weeks of searching online, I found a small cabin for rent, far enough from town that no one would come near for miles. It was rustic, barely modernized, and exactly what I wanted. The owner promised complete privacy, electricity powered by a small solar panel, and a clear view of a nearby lake. The price was steep for what it was, but I didn't care. I wanted isolation, and I wanted it badly. I arrived late in the afternoon, driving a beaten-up SUV over gravel roads that twisted and turned through dense forest. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the thick pine trees. By the time I saw the cabin, I could hardly make out its shape through the trees. It was a small wooden structure, weathered by years of rain and wind, with a small porch that had a creaky wooden railing. The windows were dusty, and the door looked like it had not been repainted in decades. I felt a shiver of excitement and apprehension. This was exactly what I had come for. The first thing I did was unload my supplies. I had packed as if I were going to be stranded for a week, which in essence I was. Food, water, a first aid kit, flashlights, batteries, a portable stove, and blankets filled the small space inside the cabin. There were 2 rooms, a main living space and a tiny bedroom with a lumpy mattress. The air smelled of old wood, pine, and a faint mustiness that came from years of neglect. The silence was immediate. Unlike the distant hum of cars and the chatter of people I was used to, here there was nothing, just the soft rustling of leaves outside. I set up a small fire in the metal stove, just to take the chill off the room. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted with deep oranges and purples. I walked to the porch and looked at the lake in the distance. It was still, reflecting the sky perfectly. I felt a sense of calm, the kind that comes only from being completely alone. I reminded myself to stay alert, of course. Forests can be dangerous, and this area was known for occasional bear sightings. I checked my gun for comfort, though I doubted I would need it. I had read too many stories of hikers and campers getting caught off guard by their own imagination. I promised myself I would not let fear take hold. The first night passed uneventfully, except for the sounds of the forest. I lay awake, listening to what I initially thought were small animals scurrying near the cabin. Every now and then, a sharp snap of a branch would make me tense, but eventually, my mind relaxed. I reminded myself that the wilderness was filled with life and that most of it was harmless. I fell asleep finally, lulled by the wind and the distant lapping of the lake. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I packed water, a small knife, and a basic first aid kit, and I set off on the narrow dirt path that led into the forest. The trees were tall, the ground soft with pine needles, and the air was crisp. I walked for hours, letting my eyes take in every detail. Birds flitted between branches, and squirrels chased each other along the forest floor. It was peaceful, almost too perfect. There was a rhythm to my steps, and I felt completely removed from the world I had left behind. It wasn't until the 3rd day that I first noticed something unusual. I had returned from a morning walk around the lake and found the cabin door slightly ajar. I could have sworn I had locked it. My heart pounded in my chest as I carefully stepped inside. Everything appeared untouched. Nothing seemed out of place. I rationalized it as my own negligence. Perhaps I had not shut it properly. Still, an unsettling feeling lingered. I triple-checked the windows and locked the door again, pressing my ear to the wood to make sure no one was outside. Silence. Only the wind. That night, the sounds of the forest were louder. I could hear movement near the cabin. Something brushed against the side wall repeatedly, soft but deliberate. My imagination tried to rationalize it. Branches, raccoons, wind, but my stomach tightened. I kept my flashlight within reach and my knife beside the bed. I did not sleep well that night. On the 4th day, I went further into the forest, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear my mind. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt. They were human, much larger than mine, and they led from the cabin into the denser woods. I stopped and studied them carefully. They were fresh, no more than a day old. My pulse accelerated. I had expected isolation, not the presence of someone else. I decided to follow the tracks, curious but cautious. I kept to the shadows, moving quietly, and tried to remember the path back. Hours passed. The tracks led deeper into the forest, to a section I hadn't explored before. The trees were thick and the undergrowth was dense. The forest floor was uneven, roots sticking out and fallen branches everywhere. I was careful not to make noise. Then I saw something that froze me. Remnants of a campsite, an old, torn tent, a makeshift fire pit, and scraps of food. It looked abandoned, but the area smelled faintly of smoke, and the fire pit had some ashes that looked recent. Whoever had been here wasn't far. My heart raced, and I realized I needed to return to the cabin immediately. I turned around, retracing my steps as carefully as I could. When I got back, the cabin looked untouched. No one was there, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest town was 2 hours away, and the roads were narrow and winding. I decided to stay, to be careful, and to keep my eyes and ears open. That night was the worst. I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Something brushed against the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, ready to confront whoever, or whatever, was outside. I shone the light through the window and saw a shadow moving along the edge of the porch. It was human. My mind raced, considering every scenario. I could run, I could hide, I could try to scare them off. But running meant leaving the cabin unguarded. I decided to stay inside and make noise if necessary. Hours passed like this. The shadow remained on the edge of my vision, always just out of reach of the light. I heard it shift, retreat, then return. I realized this was no animal. Someone had been watching me, studying me. Panic began to set in. I knew that in a place like this, an intruder could be dangerous. I stayed awake all night, too alert to sleep, listening for every sound. By morning, I was exhausted, but the intruder was gone. The following day, I decided to take action. I reinforced the cabin as best I could, moving furniture to block windows and doors, checking locks, and preparing an escape plan in case someone returned. I also started making a mental map of the surroundings, noting any possible exit routes and clearings where I could signal for help if necessary. I stayed alert, but I needed food and water. I carefully walked to the lake, keeping to the shadows, checking the area for signs of anyone else. Nothing. The lake was calm, peaceful, and empty. That evening, I set traps around the cabin. Not lethal ones, just to alert me if anyone approached. Tripwires, cans, anything that would make noise. I set a small fire in the stove and tried to rest, but sleep was minimal. The fear of someone returning kept me tense. By the 5th night, I realized this couldn't continue. I needed to get out and get help. The next morning, I packed a bag lightly, leaving most of my belongings behind. I kept water, some food, my knife, and my phone, though reception was poor. I moved quietly through the forest, using the map I had memorized. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I stayed low, taking care not to leave clear tracks. After hours of tense walking, I finally reached the road. It was a small gravel path, almost hidden by the trees. I followed it, and after what felt like forever, I saw a car in the distance. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped. Relief hit me like a wave. I explained as much as I could, and they gave me a ride to the nearest town. Authorities were notified, and a search of the area around the cabin revealed something horrifying. An abandoned camp with human waste, signs of prolonged stay, and discarded tools. Whoever had been watching the cabin had left, but the authorities warned me that people like that could return or could have been using the area for a long time. The reality of the situation hit me hard. I had been living next to someone capable of observing and stalking without leaving immediate traces. In the days that followed, I was shaken but grateful. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how easily isolation could be exploited by someone with ill intent. I took precautions, stayed in more populated areas, and never returned to that cabin. The experience left a mark on me. I still love nature, still crave solitude, but now I understand the fine line between peaceful isolation and dangerous vulnerability. I learned to respect the wilderness in a new way, not just for its beauty, but for the unknown threats that can hide in its shadows. I survived because I stayed calm, prepared, and vigilant. I never saw the intruder up close, and maybe I was lucky. But every time I remember the wind through the trees, the shadow moving on the porch, the silent stalking, I understand something profound. Fear is real, not imagined, and it can exist in the most silent and beautiful places. And surviving it requires awareness, preparation, and a healthy respect for both the wilderness and the people who can exploit it. That cabin taught me more about danger than any book, any movie, or any story ever could. I had always loved getting away from the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the endless chatter, the blinking lights that never went out. It wore me down. When I finally found a small cabin deep in the woods, I thought it would be the perfect place to be alone, to clear my head, and to escape everything for a few days. The cabin was rustic but solid, built from thick logs with a steep roof and a chimney that hinted at long, cold winters. It was set back from the road, past a narrow dirt track that had more potholes than smooth stretches, and surrounded by dense forest on all sides. From the map, I could see that no one lived within at least a mile radius, which was exactly what I wanted. The first day was uneventful. I arrived just before noon, parking my old car at the edge of the small clearing where the cabin sat. I took my time unloading the supplies I had brought: food, water, a few bottles of wine, a small gas stove, and a wood pile stacked neatly near the back door. The cabin had electricity, but I preferred the idea of using candles and a small lantern. The sun was bright, cutting through the tall pines and casting long shadows across the clearing. I spent the morning exploring the surrounding area, walking a short trail that led to a small creek. The water ran clear and cold, and I dipped my hands in, enjoying the bite of it against my skin. Felt like freedom, pure and raw. No phones, no work emails, no one to answer to. As the afternoon went on, I settled into the cabin, checking that everything worked. The windows were thick, with shutters that could be closed from the inside. The front door had a sturdy lock. The interior smelled of wood and earth, a faint mustiness that spoke of years of little use. I unpacked my food, set up a small table near the window, and watched the light change as the sun moved west. By evening, the forest had shifted. Shadows grew longer and darker. The sounds of birds gave way to the low, steady hum of insects, and somewhere far off, a branch snapped as if someone or something was moving through the trees. My heart rate picked up slightly, but I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a fox. These were remote woods, wild and full of life. Night fell faster than I expected. The lantern I had brought cast a warm circle of light in the center of the main room, leaving the corners in deep shadow. I made a small fire in the stove, feeling the heat creep through the cabin. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and I could hear the occasional creak of a branch bending under its weight. The isolation, which had felt peaceful in the day, now felt heavier. It made me hyper-aware of every sound. A distant howl carried through the trees, low and mournful. My stomach tightened. Wolves, maybe. Coyotes. Either way, I was alone. I told myself I was overthinking it, that there was nothing to worry about. That night, I slept fitfully. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest kept waking me. Every snap, rustle, or distant animal noise made me tense. At some point, I thought I heard something right outside the window. A soft, deliberate crunching sound, like footsteps on the gravel path leading to the cabin. My first instinct was to check, but my mind told me to stay put. I stayed under the covers, straining to hear over my own breathing. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I slept. The next morning, I found something strange. The back door, which I had locked before bed, was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it myself. No one could have come in during the night, could they? I checked the inside carefully. Nothing seemed touched. The windows were all intact. There were no signs of forced entry. My mind raced with explanations. Wind, maybe, though the door had been solidly latched. I double-checked the locks and shook it. It was firm. My nerves were already on edge, and this didn't help. I decided to shake it off. I went out to gather some wood for the stove, keeping my eyes on the surrounding trees. Everything seemed normal, almost peaceful in the daylight. I thought perhaps it had been a mistake. Maybe I had left the door unlocked after all. Still, a sense of unease lingered. I tried to focus on practical things. Collecting enough wood, making breakfast, exploring more of the nearby trails. Later that afternoon, I was exploring the woods just beyond the creek when I found footprints. They were faint but distinct, large boots that weren't mine. My first thought was relief. They weren't human hands or paws. But then a sinking feeling hit me. They led from the creek, past the edge of the clearing, and toward the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. Whoever it was, they had been close, very close. I retraced my steps quickly and returned to the cabin, checking all entrances. Everything was the same as before, still secure. Still, the footprints remained in my mind, nagging, threatening. They hadn't left a mark inside, but they had been there. Someone had been near my cabin. That night, I set extra precautions. I placed heavy logs against the doors, pushed chairs under the handles, and positioned the flashlight I had at hand near the front door. I stayed awake much longer than I should have, watching the window shadows flicker with the wind. At some point, I heard a soft scraping at the back door. My pulse jumped, and I froze, staring at it. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and I convinced myself it was an animal. A raccoon, a bear, anything but a human. I didn't sleep well, turning over every scenario in my head. What if it had been a person just watching, maybe waiting? I had no way of knowing. The next morning, I found new signs. Something had broken branches around the perimeter of the cabin. Small twigs snapped off and scattered across the ground. Footprints again, larger this time, closer to the back window. My stomach sank. This was deliberate. Someone had been there, someone big enough to move silently through the trees. I considered leaving immediately, but I had already driven hours to reach this place, and the thought of packing in panic felt foolish. I tried to rationalize it, maybe hunters, maybe people exploring, but the deliberate nature of it made me uneasy. By the third day, I became hyper-aware of everything. I made noise when I walked, always keeping my back to the wall inside the cabin, always checking the locks. I avoided the trails, staying near the cabin, even feeling safer climbing into the attic space and keeping watch from the small window up there. The forest that had seemed beautiful and peaceful now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed too deep, every noise too calculated. I began marking doors and windows with small scratches on the frame, little marks to see if anyone had opened them. The marks were untouched, but my fear didn't subside. I found myself jumping at distant sounds, my mind filling in details that might not exist. The wind sounded like whispers, leaves rustled like feet. I slept in short bursts, always waking to the sound of something outside. On the fourth day, things escalated. I had gone out briefly to collect water from the creek, carrying only a small backpack and a hatchet for protection. The path was familiar, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I kept turning back, scanning the tree line. Nothing was there, yet I kept hearing subtle noises behind me. The snap of a twig, a soft rustle in the underbrush. When I reached the creek, I noticed that my footprints from the previous day had been followed by others. Larger prints, not entirely human perhaps, but definitely not mine. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what kind of person or animal was in the woods, but it had been moving near me for some time. I filled my water, moving quickly, never stopping, never looking down. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was sweating, my heart pounding in my chest. I bolted the doors, pushed the furniture against the locks again, and decided to stay inside for the rest of the day. That night, I had a terrible realization. I had been alone in the cabin for days, but someone else had been watching, maybe following me in the woods, maybe circling the cabin. I could hear sounds now that didn't make sense. Soft thumps on the roof, leaves shifting right outside the window. I checked my supplies. Everything was intact, yet my mind wouldn't let me believe that I was safe. I had no cell service, no way to call for help, and the nearest road was over a mile away through thick forest. I felt trapped, isolated, and vulnerable in a way I had never imagined. The fifth day, I prepared for an escape. I packed essentials in my backpack: water, some food, the hatchet, a flashlight, and extra clothing. I studied the terrain from the attic window. There was a rough path that led through the trees to the main road. It was long, steep, and littered with roots, but it was my only chance. I decided I would leave at first light before anyone or anything could approach too closely. I woke just before dawn, the sky still gray and heavy. I double-checked the cabin, making sure all doors were secured behind me as best I could. I slung the backpack over my shoulders and moved quietly out the back door. Immediately, I noticed signs that someone had been there during the night. Broken twigs, small depressions in the soil, footprints. They had been around while I slept, maybe circling the cabin, waiting. I didn't stop to think. I moved through the trees as fast as I could, keeping to shadows, avoiding open spaces. The forest was thick, every step a struggle, every branch seeming to reach for me, but I kept moving. I didn't look back. By mid-morning, I reached a clearing and, in the distance, the faint sound of a road. I pushed harder, my legs aching, my lungs burning, but I didn't slow down. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled onto the dirt road. I walked until I saw a passing car and flagged it down. The driver stopped, surprised but concerned, and I explained in short, breathless sentences that someone had been around the cabin, that I had been alone and scared. The driver listened and drove me to the nearest town. I called the local authorities, reported the cabin, the footprints, the disturbances. They took it seriously, sending a small team to check the area. They found nothing. No one had been living in the woods, no camps, no signs of anyone hiding. It was as if the place had been empty all along, except for me and my fear. Looking back, I realized that the cabin itself was never the danger. It was the isolation, the unknown, and the constant awareness that I was vulnerable. I had pushed myself into a situation where my imagination and real dangers, wild animals, unseen humans, combined into a suffocating tension. The experience left me shaken, and I knew I would never return to that level of isolation again. I learned that fear isn't always about what is there. It's often about what could be there and what you can't control. Months later, I returned to the city, to noise and people, but with a renewed sense of caution. I never camped alone in remote areas again. I realized that solitude has its price, and that being unprepared in the wilderness isn't just uncomfortable. It can be terrifyingly real. The cabin in the woods became a memory, a lesson etched into my mind, a reminder that sometimes the scariest experiences are not supernatural, not imagined, but painfully human and entirely possible. I never thought a simple weekend in the woods could turn into a nightmare, but that's exactly what happened. I had found the cabin online through a small rental site, the kind that didn't get much attention and had almost no reviews. It was far enough from the main roads that I wouldn't have to deal with tourists or loud neighbors, and it had the kind of rustic charm I liked. Weathered wooden planks, a stone chimney, a small porch that looked over the edge of a thick forest. I had been planning the trip for months. My life had been exhausting, and I just wanted silence, a place to breathe, to be alone for a couple of days. I told myself I would spend the time hiking, reading, maybe writing some notes. The drive was long, longer than I had expected. My GPS took me down narrow roads that twisted through endless trees, some of them leaning over the asphalt in ways that made me uncomfortable. Every time a branch scraped against the car, I jumped a little, though I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. As the sun began to dip low behind the horizon, the shadows of the forest grew long and heavy, turning the narrow road into a tunnel of darkness. My heart beat a little faster when I passed an old, abandoned farmhouse on the side of the road. Its windows were empty, gaping holes, and the roof had clearly caved in years ago. It looked like something out of a horror movie, though I kept reminding myself that it was just an old building. Finally, I reached the cabin. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires, and when I stepped out, the air was different from the town. It smelled of wet earth, pine, and cold damp leaves. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined, but it was solid and quiet. No one else was around. I took the bags inside, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The interior smelled faintly of mildew and wood smoke, like the place had been lived in a long time ago but had been abandoned for months. Dust covered the corners, and a few cobwebs hung in the beams. I didn't mind. I liked places that felt untouched, where everything had its own story. I unpacked, set up the small stove, and made myself some instant coffee. Outside, the forest was settling into night, the darkness thickening like a blanket. I stood on the porch for a while, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. For the first few hours, everything was peaceful. I lit a candle inside, read a book by its soft light, and tried to relax. But around 10 p.m., I noticed a sound outside. It was faint at first, almost like footsteps on the gravel, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, heart racing, straining to hear. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, a raccoon, maybe a stray dog. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. The soft crunch of gravel. I moved toward the window, careful to keep the light behind me. The darkness outside was thick, and I couldn't see more than a few feet. My stomach twisted. No deer made footsteps like this. They were too heavy, too slow, almost measured. I considered going outside, thinking I could catch a glimpse, but a part of me screamed to stay inside. I sat down and tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. I poured another cup of coffee, but my hands shook as I held the mug. I couldn't stop listening. Every time the wind moved, I thought I heard footsteps. Every snapping twig outside made me flinch. I tried to convince myself I would feel better in the morning, that the day would bring clarity and safety. I woke several times that night, startled by noises I couldn't identify. A branch scraping against the roof, leaves rustling on the porch, footsteps on gravel. Each time I held my breath, listening. When dawn finally came, I felt exhausted and tense, every nerve on edge. I forced myself to go outside to check the perimeter. The morning was overcast, the sky heavy with gray clouds. The gravel driveway was undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of anyone else around. Maybe I had been imagining things. Maybe the forest just made strange sounds at night. I spent the next day trying to settle in, hiking along the trails I had mapped out, taking pictures of the forest and streams. But the feeling didn't leave me. Every so often I would stop, feeling watched. I rationalized it as paranoia, as the nervousness of being alone in the wild. I told myself I would feel safer after I made a fire in the stone pit outside that night. Night came again. I built the fire carefully, the wood crackling, the light casting flickering shadows on the cabin walls. That was when I saw the first sign. A tree branch, broken, lying on the ground not far from the cabin. It looked recent. I hadn't noticed it in the daylight. My heart pounded. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a deer had broken it, maybe wind. But then I noticed more signs. Scrapes on the bark of nearby trees, almost like someone had dragged something heavy. And footprints in the soft dirt by the edge of the porch. They were human. Panic gripped me. I went inside, locked the doors, and checked the windows. I had no cell service, no way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away. I felt trapped. I stayed in the main room, sitting near the stove, trying to calm myself. Every shadow outside the window made me flinch. Every small sound made me jump. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and then I heard a voice, a low murmur, almost inaudible, coming from somewhere outside. It wasn't a shout, not a scream, just the sound of someone speaking softly, too low to understand. My heart raced. I grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it in front of me. The voice stopped. The forest fell silent again. Morning came again, and I made the decision to leave. I packed everything quickly, my hands shaking. As I stepped outside, I saw tracks leading into the forest, circling the cabin and disappearing into the trees. Someone had been there, watching me, waiting. I got in the car without looking back and drove without stopping. My stomach churned, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, where I finally had cell service. I called the police and reported the incident. They said they would send someone to check the cabin. Weeks later, I got a report back. The cabin had been broken into before, vandals had left evidence of trespassing, and the area was known for people living illegally in the woods. I realized how close I had come to real danger. The person who had been there could have waited for me to fall asleep, could have come in while I was outside. The thought made me shiver. Now, every time I think about that weekend, I remember the weight of the forest, the feeling of being watched, the realization that isolation in the wilderness is not always peaceful. There are people who wait, who hide, who prey on those who think they are alone. And I am careful now, always checking cabins, always making sure I can get help, always remembering how close I came to being a statistic. I never returned to that forest. I still think about it, sometimes when I see a quiet road or a cabin in the woods. The memory is vivid, and the fear is a reminder to respect not just the wilderness, but the unknown presence of others who share it. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. The last few weeks of city life had been overwhelming. Work, noise, and people everywhere had drained me completely. I needed isolation, some time away from everything. The cabin I rented was in a remote part of the mountains, far from the main roads, off-grid. It was advertised as completely secluded, perfect for getting away from it all. And that's exactly what I wanted. I packed my car carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies for at least a week, although I had planned to stay only 4 days. I also carried a first aid kit, extra blankets, a fully charged flashlight, spare batteries, and a small old hunting knife my grandfather had given me years ago. It wasn't for hunting, really, but I liked the reassurance of having it. The drive was long and slow. The further I went into the mountains, the less traffic I saw, until it was just me and the winding road. Trees lined the sides so closely that sometimes sunlight barely touched the asphalt. There were stretches where I could barely see 100 feet ahead, just the gray road disappearing into thick green. Around noon, I finally turned onto the gravel path that led to the cabin. The map on my phone showed I was close, but cell service had already disappeared long before I reached this point. The gravel road was rough, with deep potholes and uneven sections. My car rattled and groaned as I drove over it, and the silence was almost unnerving. No birds, no wind, nothing but the crunch of tires on gravel. When I finally reached the cabin, I was both relieved and uneasy. It was an old wooden building, not too large, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The trees were tall and dense, blocking most of the view beyond. There was a small, cleared area around the cabin, enough space for a car and a small fire pit. The wood of the cabin was weathered and dark, but it seemed sturdy. A thin trail led from the cabin into the forest, fading quickly into undergrowth. I parked and stepped out, letting the silence hit me fully. It was heavier than I expected, a kind of oppressive quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel watched even when no one is there. I shrugged it off as just being in a new, isolated place and carried my supplies inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. There was a small kitchen with a sink and a stove, a living area with a few chairs, and a lofted bedroom. The bathroom was tiny but functional. I unpacked my things, stacking food in the small cupboards and making the bed with the blankets I had brought. The first day passed quietly, mostly cleaning, unpacking, and exploring the small area around the cabin. I noticed that the forest felt unusually thick and dense, almost too dense, as if it could hide anything. The trees were so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. I found a small stream nearby, which gave me a source of fresh water. By evening, I had built a small fire in the pit outside. I sat by it, watching the flames, feeling a mix of satisfaction and unease. That first night, sleep came slowly. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. The wind rustling the trees sounded like whispers, and every branch snapping somewhere outside made me jump. I convinced myself it was normal. Old cabins settle, and forests are full of wildlife. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was closer, deliberate, something scraping against wood. I froze, listening, heart pounding. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, shining the light around the room. Nothing, just shadows stretching along the walls. I told myself it was a branch or some animal outside. Still, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting in the bed, listening to the forest. The next day, I decided to explore further. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, my flashlight, and my knife. The trail near the cabin was narrow, covered with roots and fallen leaves. It seemed like no one had walked here in months, maybe years. I followed it uphill, deeper into the forest. The air was cooler under the canopy, and the light dimmed as I walked. I found an old, abandoned campsite, charred remains of a fire pit, scattered tin cans, and a rusted lantern. It was strange. The cabin I rented was supposed to be the only structure in the area. I checked the surrounding trees, looking for paths or signs of people, but nothing. The forest was silent except for distant bird calls. A creeping unease settled in my stomach. I made a mental note to be careful and returned to the cabin before dark. That evening, while I was preparing a simple meal on the stove, I noticed something odd outside the window. A set of footprints in the dirt near the cabin's edge, partially obscured by shadows. They were too large and deep to be from any small animal. I froze. The footprints led from the forest to the cabin and then stopped near the fire pit. My first instinct was to think someone had trespassed, but there were no other signs, no broken branches, no marks on the cabin walls, and the path back into the forest was thick and overgrown. Whoever or whatever made them had come from the deep forest. My heart rate increased. I couldn't see who it was, and the thought of someone approaching the cabin, hidden by the forest, made my stomach churn. I debated calling for help, but my phone had no service. I was completely cut off. I spent the rest of the night listening, sitting by the window with my flashlight. I didn't hear anything more, but sleep remained elusive. Every sound, every shadow made me tense. At one point, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a shadow among the trees. I held my breath, but it disappeared. My imagination, I told myself. Yet the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. The third day, I decided to prepare better. I gathered heavy logs to reinforce the cabin door and windows as best I could. I didn't want to think about it, but the footprints had shaken me. I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone might come closer. I also made sure to stockpile water and food inside, just in case. As I worked, I noticed another strange thing. The trail I had explored seemed to have shifted slightly. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the small markers I had noticed, broken twigs, the position of stones, were different. It was as if something had moved along the trail, unseen. My unease grew. That night, the sounds outside grew louder. Branches snapping, distant rustling, the occasional thud against the cabin walls. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, listening. Around midnight, I heard it. A clear, deliberate knock on the front door. 1, 2, 3 knocks, slow and heavy. My heart froze. Whoever it was didn't rush. They knew where I was. I gripped my knife tightly, scanning the window. The knocking stopped. Silence, then movement in the woods. My mind raced. I debated leaving through the back door, but the cabin was surrounded by thick trees. There was no safe exit in the darkness. I stayed in place, trembling, until dawn. The morning light didn't bring much relief. I knew I couldn't stay passive. I packed up essential items: food, water, my flashlight, the knife, and decided to hike back to the main road. The forest felt alive with hidden eyes. Every step I took, I imagined someone following, watching from behind trees. The trail was nearly impassable in some places, overgrown and treacherous. I stumbled several times, scraping my hands and legs on branches and roots. At one point, I found fresh footprints alongside mine, slightly larger than mine, offset by a few inches, as if someone had been walking behind me, keeping pace but hidden. Panic surged. I picked up my pace, moving faster, careful not to trip. Hours passed. The sun was high, and the forest shadows shifted with the light. I emerged onto a slightly wider path, one that seemed to lead toward a road. Relief washed over me. Then I heard it, shouts, far away, unintelligible but human. My first thought was a rescue. I ran toward the sound, waving my arms. The trail opened into a dirt road, and soon after, I saw a vehicle. Two men got out, surprised to see me. I explained, quickly and simply, about the cabin and the strange events. They offered to drive me to safety. Later, at a ranger station, I learned that the area I had stayed in was known for occasional trespassers and illegal hunting camps. The footprints I had seen and the knocking could have been someone scouting the area, possibly for something criminal, but no one had been caught. I was lucky. My preparation, awareness, and caution had kept me safe. After that trip, I never returned to the cabin. The experience left me shaken, but it also left me wiser. I learned to respect the isolation of remote areas, to prepare for unseen dangers, and to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. I kept the knife, the flashlight, and the memories, knowing that my survival had depended on attention to detail and careful planning. The forest remained a place of beauty, but also a place of caution, a reminder that isolation carries risks that no advertisement or rental agreement can fully prepare you for. I had planned the trip for months, down to the last detail, believing that nothing could go wrong. The idea of escaping the city for a week in the woods, far from noise, far from people, sounded perfect. I wanted solitude, a chance to think, to breathe, to be alone with nature and my thoughts. I had rented a cabin in the mountains, a small wooden structure built by the edge of a lake, surrounded by dense forest. It was off the grid, no electricity, no cell reception, just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. The first day was easy, almost idyllic. The drive was long, winding through narrow roads with steep drops on one side. The forest seemed endless, a mix of pine and oak, the kind of trees that towered so high that when the wind blew, they moaned like old wooden doors. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow path leading to the cabin. The structure was small, roughly 20 by 20 feet, made of thick logs with a sloping roof and a stone chimney. It had a porch that overlooked the lake. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. Everything felt quiet, peaceful, almost too quiet. Inside, the cabin was bare but functional. A small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a table, a couple of chairs, a bed in the corner with a thin mattress, and a loft I could climb up to if I wanted a better view. There was a lantern on the table, candles in a jar, and a stack of firewood near the stove. No electricity, no phone reception. I made myself a simple dinner, heating some canned beans and bread, and ate while staring out the window at the water. The lake was still, reflecting the sky like glass, only disturbed by occasional ripples from a fish breaking the surface. That first night, I slept lightly, the silence both comforting and strange. I was alone, but I felt safe. The second day, I explored the area. There was a trail that led into the woods, a narrow dirt path that twisted and climbed, lined with undergrowth and fallen branches. I followed it for hours, marveling at the forest, listening to birds, insects, and the occasional crack of a twig under my feet. I collected a few pieces of firewood on the way back, careful to note where the path forked. The cabin looked inviting when I returned, and I felt a strange satisfaction in knowing I had the place almost to myself. I lit a fire in the stove, warming the room as the evening came. It was cold, colder than I expected. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows, rustling the trees. I watched the shadows move and twist outside, and for the first time, a tiny itch of unease crept into my chest. I shook it off, telling myself it was normal, natural. I was alone in the woods. Shadows moved. On the third day, I noticed the first unusual thing. I had gone out early, planning to hike along the lake's edge. The forest was denser than I thought, and the ground was uneven, littered with rocks, roots, and fallen leaves. I walked for a long time, enjoying the quiet. When I returned, the cabin door was slightly ajar. I knew I had locked it before leaving. My stomach tightened. I looked around the perimeter. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints in the mud besides mine. I double-checked the locks, pushed the door fully closed, and went inside. I couldn't explain it. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly? Maybe the wind had nudged it open? I told myself that, but a small, nagging thought settled in the back of my mind. Someone had been here. I tried to dismiss it. I spent the rest of the day chopping firewood and preparing food, trying to act normal. I didn't go far from the cabin after that, keeping the door within sight, always checking the windows for movement. That night, sleep was difficult. Every sound outside made me tense. The creak of the trees, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of the lake. I kept the lantern close, the fire roaring, though it did little to calm my nerves. I told myself I was imagining things. It was a forest. There were animals. It was normal. But when I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something brushing against the porch, my heart leapt. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and waited, holding my breath. The noise stopped. Silence returned. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning I found more signs. Small scratches along the outside of the door frame, a branch broken near the porch, footprints in the soft mud leading up to the cabin. They weren't mine. They were human. I stared at them for a long time, feeling a cold dread settle over me. Someone had been here maybe more than once. My first thought was to leave, but the nearest town was miles away, and the road was long and treacherous. I was isolated. I had to be careful. I felt my anxiety grow into something heavier, a weight pressing on my chest. Every noise outside, every shadow, every movement seemed magnified, threatening. I stopped going outside alone, limiting myself to short trips to gather firewood, always keeping the door in sight, always listening. Days passed like this. The forest seemed alive in ways that unnerved me. The wind carried strange sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Sometimes the faint echo of footsteps when no one should be there. I started noticing things inside the cabin too. Objects slightly moved, a jar on the table not where I left it, a log shifted by the fire. Every time I rationalized it as the wind, or maybe I had moved something and forgotten. But deep down, I knew someone had been inside. Someone was watching. The isolation became suffocating. I felt my mind tightening, like a noose. I couldn't focus. I barely ate. My sleep was broken. I stayed awake most nights, the knife always within reach, the lantern casting shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to twitch when I blinked. The forest outside became menacing. Every sound was a warning. Every rustle was a threat. One evening, I decided I had to secure the cabin better. I found some old nails and rope in the shed, reinforcing the door, adding makeshift locks, boarding up windows where I thought someone could enter. I spent hours on it, exhausted, tense, trembling with every sound outside. The forest seemed to press in on me, dark and endless. When I finished, the cabin felt like a fortress, but the sense of safety was temporary. The knowledge that someone had been near, perhaps still was, kept me alert, restless, haunted by the thought of someone hiding just out of sight. On the 5th day, the weather turned. Rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming on the roof and windows, the lake churning under the wind. I stayed inside, watching, listening. That night, the wind carried a new sound, unmistakable, footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate circling. I froze, clutching the knife, heart hammering. The lantern flickered, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. The sound stopped, then started again, now accompanied by something heavier, a thud against the door. I could hear breathing, though I told myself it was the wind. It wasn't. Someone was outside, right there. I couldn't call for help. My phone had no signal. I was trapped in the cabin, isolated and terrified. I stayed still for hours, listening to the rain, the wind, the footsteps that never truly went away. At some point, they faded. Morning came, gray and wet. I waited until light before venturing out, knife in hand. The porch was damaged. Scratches in the wood, footprints visible in the wet mud, deeper than before. Someone had been here, close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to threaten me. Panic and rage collided in my chest. I had to leave. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag quickly, gathering what I needed, checking the perimeter for anyone hiding. The rain had washed away most of the tracks, but the sense of being watched never left me. I decided to take the main trail back, even though it was longer. I moved quickly, scanning the forest constantly, adrenaline sharpening every sense. The wind pushed against me, rain soaked through my clothes, and the mud made the path slippery. I slipped more than once, my hands clawing at roots and rocks to stay upright. Every shadow seemed alive. Every sound was amplified. I felt hunted. Hours later, exhausted, soaked, and trembling, I finally reached the point where the forest thinned and the road began. I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station, a small convenience store in a tiny town. I didn't even notice people at first, the presence of anyone making me jump, a relief and a fear all at once. I went inside, soaked and shivering, buying a bottle of water, trying to calm down. I realized only then how close I had been to a breaking point, how thin the line had been between the safety of solitude and the terror of being hunted. I felt relief, but also a lingering fear, a sense that someone, had been following me, watching me, and could have acted at any moment. In the days that followed, I reported the cabin to the rental agency. They found signs of someone having been inside, maybe multiple times, using the property without permission. There were no clear signs of how long, or who, just evidence of intrusion. Someone who had lived off the land in the shadows of the forest, moving unseen, careful, dangerous. I never went back. I realized that no amount of preparation could have fully protected me. The isolation I sought had a price. Nature was beautiful, peaceful, but it could also hide danger, and the human element, the unknown stranger, was the most terrifying of all. I learned to appreciate safety, to value people, light, and contact, and the small comforts of civilization that I had taken for granted. I understood the terror of being truly alone and vulnerable, and the weight of fear that grows when you know someone can reach you and there's nothing you can do. The cabin still exists, still there by the lake, empty now, but I can never return. The memory of the footsteps, the scratches, the presence that never revealed itself fully, will stay with me forever. A lesson that solitude in the wilderness comes with a cost, and that sometimes the most frightening things are not what you see, but what you cannot.